Is political violence acceptable and under what conditions will be the debate, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, whose side would like to go first?
I think. Oh, that's a good question. Should we just flip a coin, or do we have a
Okay.
preference?
Well, Bill, I'll just say I'll go first if you want. We'll start this.
Do you guys
Unless
have?
anyone has an
Works
issue?
fine by me. Works.
Yeah.
Suits me.
Also,
to
should
ping pong the
yeah, we should
back and forth.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So one person from one side goes with their opening statement, and then the next person from another side goes. That makes sense.
Now, people
Whatever
seem
you
to
wanna
be
do.
confused by this proposal. I didn't see much much comprehension there.
Okay. The
Here.
proposal
Okay,
is that.
hang on. Sorry. So what's being suggested is that
No Chopin?
Wick goes first, then someone from our team, then someone from his team, and so on.
Okay. So I'm going to write this out so we have it all well and ordered. So, okay. Sunday. And who said they wanted to go first?
Wick did. So it'll
Wick
be
wants to go first. Fantastic. So then we'll go Wick, and then who on the other side next?
Me.
Okay. Then President Sunday, and then who on Wick's side?
Why don't
I'll go
why don't we just go around the
to you,
room like
Box.
Wick, Sunday, Loner, Doe, Meat, and Sirius? It works out.
Flip me and Sirius, and I'm down with it.
Sure. Okay. So me, Sirius, Doe, Wick. I'll do it for you. Professor Meat, Loner Box. Sound good?
No, I was going before Professor Meat.
Like almighty.
Oh my god.
Why? Okay, we're making this a lot more difficult.
It
than
doesn't matter. I'm joking. Don't worry.
Okay. Sounds great.
Oh. Well,
whenever you wanna. Yeah.
of course, on your go. Go right ahead.
Fair enough. Okay. So, hi. Today I will be talking about political violence. There has been much to do over the last few years about the efficacy or morality of violence in protests, violence in riots, if you will, and violence in political activism in general. Many people have pointed to the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement had riots and things like that, and they will quote MLK, riots are the voice of the unheard. Therefore, we shouldn't be telling people how to protest whose rights are being stripped from them or rights are being taken away from them. I am sympathetic to that. However, I believe that if we want to see serious change, then the data suggests, and intuitively we can figure this out, that nonviolent civil resistance is the path forward. I am not here to argue that violence never works or is never necessary. That's not my argument. My argument is simply that civil resistance is more effective both in democracies and in authoritarian governments and has been since post-World War II. I think that this is a clear situation where if you want to get change done and accomplished, the best way to do that is through nonviolent means. And I would contrast that with peaceful means, because nonviolence does not mean peaceful. Nonviolent civil resistance does create conflict. It does put pressure on various actors and institutions.
Coming up.
Am I 2 minutes up?
Just about, yeah.
Okay, I'll just end it at this. So again, if we're serious about wanting to help people achieve political change, nonviolence is what we should advocate for.
Okay. And rolling to the other team.
I guess I'll just start right now. Thank you, first of all, Vosh, for agreeing to host this. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
So I take the question with which tonight's debate is concerned to be twofold: whether nonviolent or violent resistance is more politically efficacious, and whether the use of violence is permissible ethically. The very terms in which both questions are given are highly problematic, and indeed heavily problematized by the literature on political resistance, which, due to the ambiguity inherent in this word violence, is recently moving away from framing such questions in terms of a violence-nonviolence dichotomy, and is rather concerned with differences of outcome between armed and unarmed political resistance. Given such ambiguities, the claim my side has to defend is comparatively modest and easily defended. Whether or not the disciplined avoidance of violence has been efficacious in some case or other, the classic examples being the Satyagraha movement of Gandhi and the civil rights movement, these are not sufficient to take violence off the table in all or even most cases. For instance, although studies often find that violent resistance can hinder the success of nonviolent movements, leaving aside the ambiguity and inconsistency with which the term violence is treated, this conclusion is frequently arrived at by collapsing the aims of violent fringes, quote unquote, with that of the larger mainstream movement, potentially erasing the identities and goals of what are in fact distinct movements in themselves. Further, if we consider the success of such movements as those of MLK and Gandhi to be worth the human cost of even some deliberate violence to attain, dogmatically taking violence off the table in all cases would be both anti-pragmatic and unethical. This becomes more obvious when one considers the prior or adjacent violence, which also contributes to political outcomes alongside nonviolent movements, for example, that of the Indian National Army, which made the continued domination of India seem increasingly costly and untenable. In short, while nonviolence is of course always desirable, no sane person would advocate on behalf of violence for its own sake. Violence cannot be written off either strategically or ethically without also deciding that the cause of any movement which cannot prevail without violence is de facto forfeit due to an implicit preference for state power. State power, of course, being enforced by definition with violence. Thank you.
All right, and rolling back to the other side, Loner Box or Professor Meat, who would prefer?
I'll go.
All right.
I think one obvious thing is that everyone from any political persuasion does support violence in some form, right? It just depends on where and when and in what context. For example, I think there's always this impression that people give of liberals as being very averse to violence and more pursuing like civility politics and nonviolence, but that's not even entirely true. If you look at the Ukraine war, liberals they're a united front on arming the fuck out of Ukraine and pushing Russians all the way out. Whereas if you ask people on the left, you would normally expect to be more violent on that issue. They're like, it's a coin flip of whether or not they're okay with that, or if they want to get Ukraine to cede land in exchange for peace. So it depends on where and when. I think because of what happened on Twitter a few weeks ago, I was looking at I looked at the whole essay of MLK's letter from Birmingham jail. There's one bit in there that I think is really surprising, not the white moderate bit, but the part where he talks about how he's rejecting the claim that he's an extremist because he talks about how he himself feels like he has to be a moderating voice between complacency on one end of the black community and violence on the other, being the Nation of Islam and black nationalists. And he even says that he's really like concerned that if the black nationalist movement grows, then America would descend into a racial nightmare, is what he says. And if you look at MLK's activism, it's like he was incredibly strict and like very, very nuanced in his political tactics. He even after they would first exhaust all negotiations with legislators in their particular states that they were going for, and then after that, if that failed, they would go through what was called self-purification, where they would drill people down on the ethics of nonviolence, the morality of it, the pragmatism of it. They would collect knives and weapons from protesters before marches to make sure that no one lashed out. And if you look at that, those 10 years from 1955 to 65, they achieved more in that period than in the 100 years before that. And all those groups, NAACP, SNCC, CORE, SCLC, they all did it by adhering to nonviolence. So, yeah.
Okay. And as we are rolling back around, Doe or Sirius, your preference? Sunday, we're getting some noise from your mic.
Oh, are you?
Yes.
Is it me?
I believe it was Sunday's mic, or maybe it wasn't. Well, whatever the case. Doe or Sirius, whoever would prefer.
All right, I'm next up. All right. So when debating the question of nonviolent resistance, its proponents tacitly assume the role of event organizer, where they're in full control of the tactics used by a social movement. They tend to think in terms of efficiency, a logic of getting the most out of every movement action. However, this sort of thinking tends to miss the organic and unplanned nature of violent action. Whether we like it or not, violence will always be a part of every social movement. The question, then, should be how we think and talk about violence amongst ourselves and to the public. While scholars are often split on the outcomes of violent action, finding differential positive and negative effects depending on the study or classification of violence, one thing they tend to agree on is the fact that what people perceive as violent is highly dependent on the nature of the protest movement and the way it's framed by those who talk about it. Studies consistently find that the framing of a protest event as violent will lessen support for the cause it represents, regardless of the actual nature of the protest. The same event can engender either positive or negative attitudes depending on if it's contextualized as violent. Moreover, scholars consistently find that the perception of nonviolence is dependent on the composition of the protest movement. In the American context, racial minorities are the prime example. Protests comprised mostly of racial minorities are more likely to be seen as violent, even when people are assured that the protests were peaceful. All this is to say that as members of a given social movement, the question of tactical efficacy is almost irrelevant. Tactics emerge outside of any single person's control. In the event of such violence, then, our energy should not be put towards policing our own, but towards seizing and reframing the narrative. Once you've allowed your opposition, those with all the power, to
20
set
seconds.
the terms of engagement, you've lost. It is neither just nor efficient to allow oppressors to dictate the terms of oppression.
Okay, thank you. Up next, Professor Meek.
What's up, y'all? Doesn't seem like the efficacy of violent protests is taken too seriously in academia, which, to be fair, is some of the criticisms of previous research that was in the sort of steel-manning papers of the position that I was able to find. What little evidence I could find has a variety of like pretty major flaws that makes it mostly irrelevant as far as I can tell at best. And even taking that out of the equation, doesn't really support. Even if I disregard that, the evidence that I can find doesn't really support the conclusion. As far as I can tell, it's one of the most fundamental like building blocks of society. This idea that one of the most fundamental appeals of a society, of a civilization, is the idea that you are free from the fear of people coming along and saying, we're going to fuck your shit up if you don't give us what we want. That's a little crude way of saying it, but I don't really, I think that people don't want to live in that world, whether or not they even realize it. I think we tend to intellectualize this issue in a way that sort of makes this out of touch, because I don't really, when I imagine people in the population, I don't really see these people that would be moved by violent protest. I don't really see, even the most fearful among us are more likely to go save me daddy government than to say, we'll give these people what they want so that we're going to stop. And even if you're going to argue that violence gets attention to your cause, I don't really see that as a justification for violence, even if it's true in practice, because it seems more like a justification for laziness. Because all that tells to me when I hear that is that it doesn't seem to me there to be any reason to believe that violence is the only way to gain attention to your cause. So it seems to me that if that's a justification, not to put words in anyone's mouth, that's merely a reason that movements ought to be, that otherwise might be violent, ought to be more creative. Any countercultural phenomenon has a natural burden put on it to be beyond reproach if it wishes to best succeed. If you're trying to dissolve or overthrow an authority or a government, then obviously, like in the case of an actual revolution, violence makes sense. But outside those bounds, I don't think violence is sort of antithetical to sensible protest, as far as I can tell.
Okay, thank you. And now finally, Doe.
Proponents of nonviolence are almost universally not proponents of nonviolence. They are instead majority-minded people who see democracy itself as a greater goal than the plight of any oppressed minority peoples. Martyrdom is the nonviolence dogmatist's path towards justice, especially martyrdom of others. Oppressed peoples are made to play the role of martyr, submit to oppression publicly until the majority's mind is changed. Justice is made when the majority changes its legal structures. Liberal theorists on civil disobedience tell us how much more important it is that the authority structures of the majority are not threatened than the suffering of oppressed peoples defending themselves. Oppressed peoples should be more thoughtful about the sensibilities of the majority, they say, or else is implied. This is not a politics of nonviolence. This is a politics of our violence. The most obvious place to see this at play is in the research done into nonviolent resistance. Despite whatever other problems that arise in trying to delineate violence from nonviolence, damage to property is treated as violence consistently throughout these studies, leaving the construction of property completely out of the frame. the construction of a world by those in seats of power, like strapping murderous highways across every nation, forcing the majority of people to become reliant on cars, machines which poison the air and slaughter 3,700 people and over 1 million vertebrate animals a day, are treated as non-violent, completely neutral acts. This is the false thesis. We do not see the sensibilities of the majority as a worthy metric for justice, and as such, our allegiance cannot be to nonviolence, legalist structures, or any other political technology deployed to privilege some over others. Our allegiance remains to justice, and it is not just to dogmatically let the innocent get abused.
I would, I guess we're doing opens now. Would you just kind of go with it?
Right.
Yeah.
Very
Okay.
quickly before
Wait,
you
can I
go,
go
Vic.
before you?
Really quickly.
Hang on. I've got one for Vosh.
Well,
Professor
I've got one from
no,
me.
but it's a technical. It's a
Technical
Professor
thing.
Mead is
Okay,
very,
technical. Right. Go ahead. Technical.
Yes, Professor Mead is very quiet. Is there any way you can boost your volume?
Yeah.
That is technical. As for everyone talking, 3v3 is a lot of people. Try not to shout over each other too much. If necessary, then we'll start doing turns. But ideally, you could go back and forth without that being necessary. So go on ahead.
Yeah, I'll just real quick, like the idea of justice. I want to touch on that. So there are two things that were said that I want to touch on briefly. The first is Sirius. I'll go in the order. Sirius mentioned that a lot of the problems with violence is it happens organically. It's not organized. It just kind of happens. You can't really control it. I think that's one of the main issues with violence and violent protests, and is because we know that organization wins in these cases. The more organized, the more tactical, the more coherent a group or a advocacy, minority or whatever is, the more likely they are to succeed. And what violence is a poor tool of communication. No one really knows what you're trying to say. All they're seeing is the big explosions or the bloody noses. And this is why, again, while it might not be just that people have to suffer, it's reality. And
So
this
then-
is how the world works.
Okay, so then what should we do when violence inevitably happens in a protest movement? What should we do about it?
Condemn it vociferously.
Why?
Yeah. Why? That seems like a waste of our resources. Like, are we going to go out on the streets and protest the protesters? It seems like our resources are better spent reframing the narrative so that people don't see it as
I mean,
violent.
typically the leaders would just, when they've got the next chances, they would say they condemn the riots. I mean, even Language of the Unheard, in that speech, he condemns violence. Like it's not like you have to make a new protest against it, right?
You are presuming, though, the presence of an extremely charismatic and influential individual who is capable of actually rallying an entire protest around a single program. When you're not in that kind of situation, it seems to me that you do, in fact, end up simply protesting the protest again, undercutting the momentum of whatever they both have in common.
If you're talking civil rights, that's not entirely the case, because it wasn't just MLK and the SCLC, right? It was also the NAACP, it was the SNCC, it was CORE, it was most of them, right? It was most of these organizations. Some of them did flip towards like a self-defense approach, which is more nuanced, but yeah, they were mostly nonviolent.
You clearly have a much more
legislation was passed.
nuanced. You clearly have a much more developed understanding of the details of that case than I do, but be that as it may, nonetheless, in the absence of these, you still find yourself in that situation. If you don't have organizations with legitimacy and the sort of unitary pull to kind of adhere a multifaceted, widespread group to a single program of action, discipline in nonviolence becomes impossible. And so as a consequence of this, when violence inevitably occurs, if you actually allocate all of your resources towards protesting that, you've undercut the momentum of your movement. There's no way around that.
I
Well,
think
even if we were to accept theoretically, right, this idea that like, which I mean, I think is sort of inevitably true. Like even for my side's belief system, if we were to say that, well, let's just convince everyone that they weren't actually violent. Well, sure, I'm sure that would, even according to our worldview, of course, that would increase support for it. But doesn't that seems to me that regardless of whether or not it's the case, it seems to me that is simply another reason why more peaceful protests would be better. I'm not saying
Well,
you have to
there's a-
devote all of your
Well,
resources
there's a flip
to it,
side. There's a
Yeah,
flip side to this that you're very quickly, and then I'll let you go. There's a flip side to this that you're not considering, and that's that even in the event of quote unquote nonviolent protests and the studies that you could refer to in order to determine whether or not nonviolent versus violent quote unquote protests are more efficacious, oftentimes what constitutes a violent or a nonviolent protest is itself radically determined on whether or not, for example, they can people doing the study consider armed versus unarmed to be the distinguishing factor between violent versus non-violent, or whether, for example, windows being targeted versus persons being targeted indicates violent versus non-violent. And the bare fact of 1 or 2 people out of a crowd of 100,000 smashing a window somewhere can be taken up by the media and used to color a completely peaceful protest, a completely non-violent protest, as violent nonetheless. And so either way, you still find yourself in the reverse situation, in which a non-violent protest can be very easily manipulated optically to look like a violent protest, regardless of how disciplined it actually is. And indeed, this did happen with MLK's protests too.
Well,
Doesn't this doesn't that back
Did
up?
MLK make
Sorry,
his job easier by being disciplined with his people? Wasn't that why he preached discipline? Like MLK preached and spent so much effort in organizing basically extremely disciplined protesters.
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. He didn't just organize discipline and nonviolence with his protesters. He also orchestrated the protests, and this is one of the reasons why Malcolm X detested MLK. He also orchestrated a situation in which the most innocent of his protesters, including children, would be in direct confrontations with the police and result in an appalling display to horrify the public. So it's
Isn't he just putting something on display that's already happening in that state, though?
No, he was creating the conditions for that violence to be put on display. Like that was part of the explicit. No, but that was part of the explicit strategy. Was to it was a martyrdom strategy where you go out there and you get beat up in order to draw sympathy towards your cause. That was
a martyrdom strategy, but it wasn't passive. Sorry, Lauren.
No, but you're referencing Project C, where they wanted to fill up. It was Bull Connor in Birmingham. They wanted to fill up his jail with kids. I'm pretty sure King objected to that, but it was adopted anyway. But yeah, you're right. Like they did basically say go and confront very racist and very aggressive cops and just let them hit you. But I think their tactic as well was they would specifically get the more seasoned like veterans of the movement to stand in front so they could absorb the blows. So this whole thing about like throwing kids is maybe a little bit like that was like that. I think that happened once. It was even very controversial within the movement.
So I think we're talking around the issue here, and that is of organization. Yes, if your movement is disorganized and has no central leadership and no central kind of drive, it's less likely to succeed, whether it's violent or not. It just is, right? There are so many benefits to having a coherent community coalesce around a single banner, basically, even if it's multiple groups. This can't be understated. And violence, to be clear, is divisive in that way. It will automatically gatekeep who can participate in the protest.
I don't think that's true, Wick, because from what I've read, it seems like violence offers another alternative way of expressing discontent that isn't available to a lot of people. Like a lot of people don't have the time or energy to join like a disciplined protest movement, but they might have the time to like get off and like go out onto the streets to riot just on one day.
If you aren't strong, if you aren't able to enact violence, and most people aren't. Let's be clear. Kids, elderly, these people generally can't do violence on the same level that I could. Or
I mean, so long as destruction of property is considered violent, I'm pretty sure each and every one of those can sabotage plenty of things without much effort.
Well, Wick, you seem to have this conception of an effective violent protest. No, hang on. You seem to have this notion of an effective violent protest as being like the 300 Spartans at the front line of a rally in the street. But violent protest incorporates more than just actually going fisticuffs with the cops toe to toe, right? So, for example, Gandhi's Satyagraha movement, I can never bloody pronounce that, was itself committed to nonviolence, but it was massively aided by the fact that the Indian National Army was also bombing and assassinating the British during that entire time, making the holding of India seem increasingly unpopular. That aided in the efficacy of Gandhi's movement. Now
you can point to one-offs where that might be true, but I'm talking in general. We're talking about generalities.
No, but the generality is on my side.
Even in general, Erica Chenoweth, who is your primary source, Chenoweth. She recently wrote a paper where she said that violent flanks of the movement have mixed effects. that it isn't just straightforwardly about positive or negative, that there's both positive and negative effects to having a violent but unarmed section, which is what riots are. Riots are violent but unarmed.
So the problem here again is when we want a movement to succeed, right? Whether it be in an authoritarian regime, such as Balkans or things like that, with the butcher of the Balkans, Milosevic was his name, right? Very violent, very repressive regime there. And then we have democracies such as America, right? Back in the 60s and even today. In both cases, what violence does is it keeps people from participating because so many people are just naturally, instinctually, intuitively disinclined to do violence towards the people around them. That's just the natural state. And so when you see people getting when you come across a person, you have no context, you don't know what's going on, you see one person beating the shit out of the other, most people's instinct are to defend the person who's being beat up. Whether or not the person deserved getting hit, that doesn't come into play. We don't know. We don't see. So when we talk about framing narratives, you're right that there are certain groups out there who will frame anything as violent, no matter how small, how limited, anything like that. But it does us no service to stand in front of a burning building and preach how things are mostly peaceful. That was a gift to the people against your movement. It was a gift to the people who oppose what you want to see. And we can't let that happen. We just have to call balls and strikes. And if things are violent, we condemn it. And when things aren't, we say, no, you're wrong. But people have to trust us. And right now they don't.
And the thing with BLM, though, you were talking about the idea of having to have like very seasoned protesters to make sure that it stays very like well behaved. But like BLM protesters were not like well trained, but they were mostly peaceful. And also, how many videos did we watch of antagonists within BLM protests trying to instigate violence? Even that weird guy with the fucking black over his head who was smashing those windows, and everyone tried to stop him. Like, that's what they mean. But that's what if I say condemning violence within your movement, that's what I mean, right? Like, just you see it, you stop it, and definitely don't like try to adopt it as a strategy unless you're in like fucking South Africa or something, you know, when it's like when everything else has been exhausted.
So wait, that one guy that people tried to stop, should they physically try to stop him?
Maybe, yeah.
So
or
they
just
should
gather
use
around him,
force
film him.
themselves?
Well, it depends on
Yeah.
the context. If he's like beating up
Depends.
babies, yeah, stop.
If he's
that.
hitting, if he's maybe smashing up windows, just like film him, catch him doing it, try to identify him for the police.
So just to be clear,
Wait, you want to
hang on.
identify protesters?
No, just very quickly. So just to be clear, you guys are entirely in line with protesters engaging in violence, provided it is only targeting people who are identified as other protesters.
That's
But
not
we
true
think
at all.
totally differently about defensive violence versus
that is-
escalating to violence, right?
What it is violence. Like if I forcibly stop somebody from smashing a window, that is violence. You can.
That's it's
Well, yeah, but we
yes,
also-
but it's a
we
different
also would-
scale. There's
if
a.
people start-
Do you not just let me quick? Serious. Do you not understand the difference between someone hitting someone in the face and someone stopping someone from hitting someone? in the
Wait.
face?
Can I ask?
Oh no! In this case,
Wait.
it would actually be. Oh, actually, Doe, you can go. You can go.
I was gonna say, can you see the difference between like cars murdering 1 million vertebrates every single day and someone, I don't know, what's a number of things you could do? Sabotaging a car plant,
Yes, blowing up a car plant is more violent than a car existing.
I
I didn't say
will- I
will bite
sabotaging.
that
Hold on,
bullet.
I didn't say blowing up. I didn't say blowing
Yeah.
up. I said
Sabotage.
sabotaging. Sabotage is very, very, very. There's a large range of things you can do, but like, yeah. So murdering animals, just like 3,700 people every day, murdering them is less violent than stopping a car company from producing cars.
Just to come back to the question about the guy smashing windows, I think what was the most common thing to respond to that was basically people just let them know that they were on their own, that they didn't represent the movement. It was showed on camera to show the public that this isn't like what we're for, and then the person fucked off and they would just boo them or something. That was like the most common thing. I saw.
Look, that's fair, and I don't think any of us would contend against, for example, a protest maintaining some level of order or standards of conduct within their group. But when we're talking about directing your attention towards condemning protest violence, we're not talking about one or two people, which will exist in every single movement or can be projected to exist in every single movement, regardless of the explicit policy, no matter how carefully it's enforced within the movement. We're talking about other movements that are alongside, looking towards the same ends, that are engaging in different strategies. So, for example, there is one movement that is dogmatically against any kind of physical altercation, even in self-defense. That'd be the MLK strategy. There's another one that's like, well, no, if the cops bash against us, we bash them back, we maintain our bodily integrity, et cetera, et cetera. If you direct your resources against that group, you're effectively giving propagandistic fodder to the other group, which can then paint the movement as a whole as intrinsically violent, except for some of the good ones. You see the problem?
So the problem is, at least in the MLK movement, right? If we're going to use a civil, I think that's the one that people go to because they're most familiar with it. But we have data to suggest that even when violence was started by the police and then the people simply fought back, that still ended up being kind of a wash in effectiveness. And people tended to side with the state. Just that's their bias, right? And we can say that's not fair, that's not just. I agree, but that's generally what happens. And I think most of what we're going to get to here is the other side is saying, well, I can give you a source, right? But it was a study done in very recently, basically, that showed that basically the riots led to the election. The 68 riots specifically.
The civil rights movement isn't a great example simply for the reason that the Civil Rights Act was being tied up for years before Kennedy was assassinated. And then a more savvy politician in Lyndon B. Johnson came in and managed to get it pushed through.
What do you mean it was being tied up?
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
I think Kennedy introduced it in the same year he was killed, no?
Mm-hmm.
No, not unless I'm very mistaken. I can.
He took it to Congress in '63, right?
He took it to Congress in '63, but the historical record, I believe, is that Lyndon B. Johnson was actually successful in pushing it through, and that it was being tied up by the Democrats at the time. I'd have to get the particulars though, so I'm going to claim the same thing that Wick just did.
Okay.
Yeah. Either way, I think that what we're going to get to here is a difference in what we want the world to be versus what the world is. I would love to live in a world where, yes, people were able to suss out the nuance of violence in an event and understand that not everyone who is being violent is necessarily in the wrong. But that's not the world we actually live in. The world we actually live in, people abhor violence. They want stability more than anything else. And when you threaten that stability, or you appear to threaten that stability, they are going to largely side against you. So what you need to do is to demonstrate that the people you are going against are the ones that are threatening your stability. And the best way to do that, like it or not, is the martyr strategy. It is to have people beat you up, get shown on TV.
Okay, so sorry
that's just what wins.
Sorry to cut off this Braveheart speech, but very quickly. So it seems like what actually happened was Kennedy had this referred to the Rules Committee. Lyndon B. Johnson had this brought before the Senate. And that was the key difference here. So Johnson made a different move than Kennedy did, which resulted in the bill actually being pushed into effect as opposed to being held up in debate.
And I think also Lyndon B. Johnson had a massive majority when he ran on civil rights, because by that point, support for civil rights, I think it was in the 50s, I think 20% of Americans saw it as the biggest issue in America, but then by Lyndon Johnson, it was more than half because of what they were seeing happening in the South.
So I want to
all the images
really
of the cops. Yeah.
Okay.
Loner Box, really quick. Previously, did you say that in Letter from a Birmingham Jail, Martin Luther King Jr. condemned the riots? The violence?
No, it's in language of the unheard. He condemns violence in a lot of places. So yeah.
Oh, just
in the middle. Just in the middle of Letter from a Birmingham Jail, he says, "In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence." But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possessions of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act by the misguided populace in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion?
I know that, but you're referring, what actions is he referring to that they're condemning? He's not referring to violence.
Let me
What
read you
accents is he
another
referring
quote.
to?
Let me read you another quote
violence.
from the letter from Birmingham
Yeah.
jail. He says, I started thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the community. One is a force of complacency made up of, I'm not going to use that word, who, as a
No,
result of long years of repression, have
I
been
was
so
being
completely
okay.
self-drained of
I would have.
self-respect and sense of
Let
somebodyness.
them fight.
And then the other force is one of bitterness and hatred and comes perilously close to the advocating of violence. It is expressed in the various black nationalist groups that are springing up over the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. The movement is nourished by the contemporary frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination. So yes, he
Right.
does condemn the
No,
violence.
yeah, this isn't even a debate. Of course, I'm like he condemned violence of the protesters. When he's talking about they precipitate violence, he's talking about the strategy, which was to go and get the shit beaten out of you by cops. That's what he's talking about.
Yeah, the disagreement that he has
No,
with
no, no,
the
wait,
moderates are that
no, no,
violence
wait.
will not
Wait. Was I wrong about that or what?
No, you're right.
Okay, thanks. Cool.
I'm not disagreeing with that.
What were you getting at me for then?
I asked if I asked and double checked, but I'm
Okay, cool.
this bit here. I'm sorry. This bit here is he. I'm sorry. Never mind. Honestly, I don't care about this.
I can clarify. He's talking about precipitating violence in the sense that, yes, they did want the cops to react to them violently because when they didn't, when they went to Albany, the sheriff there was very strategic. They were very calm with the protesters. And then basically they left with nothing. So when they went to Birmingham, where Bull Connor was a fucking psycho, they knew that getting the cops to attack them would look very good in the press. It would look very good internationally. And it would bring civil rights to the forefront.
Right. But
So it's the
they're
violence of the
intentionally-
cops.
So wait,
Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. That's fine.
If I can suggest a redirection, and this might actually be a more productive conversation as opposed to simply a debate, there seems to be an
Running away
intrinsic.
from the topic at hand. Okay, go ahead.
Oh, not actually. I'm actually going directly to
Wick, behave yourself.
The assumption that the opticality to a general public is critical to the success of a social movement sort of presumes that social movement or the group that constitutes a social movement, for example, if it's a case of an ethnic group asserting its rights against the broader majority, that group has to not be held in contempt in the first place. There is a long history of social movements of oppressed ethnic groups, so on and so forth, that is simply never recorded. This is one of the things I bring up in my opening statement when I talk about there's a bit of survivorship bias going on here in which we count the successful movement as representative of all of the quote-unquote violent fringes that may themselves have common cause with the mainstream movement, but are actually have their own discrete goals and values and constitution, et cetera, that are nonetheless sort of disappeared because, well, this movement succeeded. Therefore, they were just lucky enough to succeed along with them, despite the fact that they chose a losing
Do
strategy.
you not think
And
do you not think even just real quick, even
Yes.
in a because I take issue with the foundation of your statement here. So
Really?
let me simply ask that do you not think that people's perceptions of a group can be changed? So even if a group is despised, do you not think that over time and with effort that the public perception of that despised group can be changed in a more positive direction?
Well, the public perception of a group whose overt oppression people are comfortable with, say for the example in a group that has been enslaved for a significant amount of time, that group's perception is not going to be changed by that group more quietly accepting their oppression or being more passive towards it. There's going to be some kind of instigating factor
There's a
that causes an
difference
explosion of
between
attention to it.
accepting your oppression and then being violent. Civil resistance is resistance.
Oh,
You
I
are
strongly
resisting
disagree. I
your
strongly
oppression.
disagree.
You are resisting your
An
oppression.
active resistance.
You're just
an
not
active
doing
resistance.
it through blowing things up or
Well,
beating
no.
people
An
up.
active resistance is itself intrinsically violent. And if you were
Come on, no,
Wait.
no,
MLK's,
no.
but then weren't all of MLK's disruptive protests, sit-ins, were these?
Well, I mean,
these are violent now?
this is Wick's thesis. He was very careful to say that a nonviolent protest does not indicate a peaceful protest.
It
Well, I
does
think
not.
Wick would agree with me on this. He's welcome to correct me, but I think Wick would agree with me that these are examples, like MLK's protests. I know that these are easy examples to point to, but these are examples
They
of protests
represent a
that were
direct
very.
challenge. They represent a direct existential challenge to the way of life of Americans at the time.
Yeah, but
Well,
the
they were
problem is
loud
that
and
no one, the
disruptive, but
problem,
not violent.
the problem is that no one. The problem is that no one defines violence in this way outside of people who are trying to impress their first-year sociology teacher. It's like when you look at fucking, if you look at any of the academic literature in this, when they say MLK was non-violent, they're not saying he was like law-abiding, well-behaved. Yeah, he broke the law fucking loads. He deliberately got himself arrested, but they still class him as non-violent, right? When we say violence, I think we mean generally. Most people think destruction of property or physically attacking people. That's what most people mean by violence.
Well, that's sort of immaterial because the literature that's going to give you the information about whether or not nonviolent versus violent protest is more effective is not going to be using that late definition. It's going to be
They
referring
often
to
are.
whether or
They
not
do, though.
it's going to be referring to
They
whether or not they were
sometimes
armed,
do. They don't
whether or not
always.
they targeted, for example, property as opposed to persons. And by the way, some of the literature is very interesting. They have definitions that you would find sort of unintuitive. For example, they assume that media coverage of broken windows will tend towards an understanding of a movement as nonviolent versus attacks on persons, which they will identify as being more violent. But when you actually look at the coverage of the BLM riots and protests that characterized them as violent, the thing they pointed to primarily, with the exception of some cases like the Rittenhouse case, was broken windows, burning cop cars, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And I think that this highlights the importance of not giving into this kind of framing and de-emphasizing it when it comes up. Like if you are really serious about this, then you don't want to spend your protesting your resources doing all this condemnation. You just want to keep on doing what you were already doing. Another thing I wanted to say to Sunday's point earlier about you not being held in contempt. This is something that receives support in the literature, that the martyrdom strategy that we're talking about of going out and getting yourself beat up, it's not very effective when the audience is not already sympathetic to your cause. Vigilante violence against like Black people in the United States has always been super common, but it didn't garner much sympathy from the primarily white audience until after a certain point, when the audience was
that
paying
point?
more attention.
No, this is important. Why were they paying more attention? What changed between 1850, right, or let's say 1900 and 1955? What changed?
It wasn't. It wasn't.
New factor was introduced into society that changed the dynamics here? Because there's an answer to this.
There's a lot
wasn't
of
just
that's 50 years,
yeah.
which includes 2 world wars.
No, there's a.
I wasn't even talking about that long of a time period. I was talking about like Eisenhower to Lyndon B. Johnson, like that short of a time period.
The main invention in that short of a time period that became much more common and much more widely produced throughout American homes was mass media, the television, things like that. This coincided, right, with the changes in perception, because we didn't just hear about it and things like that, but you saw it. You saw the black kids being hosed down by the cops. You saw
But
that.
you've identified,
right?
but Wick, you've identified a key weakness in nonviolence as a dogmatic strategy, in that you are relying on the media covering your movement favorably.
Yes, and
You're
the
not
media
simply
will cover
only
you better
No,
in
but
general if you are nonviolent. Yes.
It's also just
No,
not.
no,
I can
but
bridge this.
that's-
Wait.
that's
I can
untrue,
bridge
though.
I can bridge the gap that you two are having. I'm going to push back on maybe Wick a little bit here, but like there is actually a perfectly good example of when nonviolence can be pursued, and if it is completely ignored by the media and the system, then they kind of leave you with no choice. Mandela was a perfect him and the ANC pursued nonviolence for decades, but after they were outlawed and after there was like numerous massacres against nonviolent protesters, and after the fucking there were like forced removals of Black communities like in the millions because they were making the cities too Black, then they decided that violence was inevitable, so they channeled it. They chose to say, okay, we're going to direct this into sabotage. They went for they deliberately targeted infrastructure because they wanted to make the country ungovernable under that system.
Yeah,
Okay,
look,
here's
I'm
another
not-
point.
I'm never saying there's never an indication.
Hold
like,
on.
there's never.
Wait.
But
Go ahead, Wick.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying that there's never a time for violence. Obviously, that's not true. There is there are extenuating circumstances, there are edge cases, there are times where you are left with literally no choice. But my argument is that on the whole, in general, nonviolent civil resistance is more effective and better and leads to better outcomes, because we
Except
have to
when it
also
doesn't.
look at what does success look like. When a violent movement, right, is successful, it is less likely to end in democracy. It is less likely to end in non-repressive
I would
regimes.
like
to
to
be clear,
interject
this is because
just a moment,
violence-
if I may.
Sorry.
I just want to interject.
This is bias from the moderator.
It is towards good conversation. So everyone present agrees there are instances where nonviolence as a doctrine is preferable and times when the opposite is preferable. Obviously, different countries, different situations, different times. Sure. I was curious on a point that got brought up earlier that I felt was under-discussed. They were talking about, well, you were talking about the degree of permissibility of violence in nonviolent movements. Because when we cite MLK, of course, a principled nonviolent actor, the way he talked about violence, rioting, property destruction, would have been considered by media today, and was then, to be overly permissive and tolerant of the violent elements of the civil rights protest. That is to say, while many in the media look to see uncritical denunciations, he would often qualify, he would categorize, he would explain, oh, well, sure, I think it's bad. However, and for that, he was often blamed for enabling the violence. To what extent do you think a non-violent movement has to condemn inevitable elements of violence that exist alongside them? How much is too far? If MLK had to toe that line in a way that upset people on both sides, I don't think there's an easy answer.
Well, I can give an answer that's actually affirmative on Wick's side. So, for example, if somebody on your side is proposing to do something horrifically violent, like to the point where we would consider this to be unpalatable, say, for example, the kidnapping and torturing of the children of whoever in order to provoke some kind of positive political response, I think under certain conditions there is a moral threshold where you would actually decide, no, like the cost becomes too high, or regardless of whether or not on balance some onlooker might like consider these to be even, you would not partake. And I think that everybody on my side would probably agree with that.
Well, the
In fact,
question is, I thought, isn't whether you partake or not. It's when it happens. So when it inevitably happens, because again,
no,
nothing is a monolith.
you would condemn. You would
how
condemn
would
and
you
would go
respond,
against.
right?
You would condemn and you would go against, probably in as strong terms as you would say, Wick. Because once again, like the threshold here for why violence is considered, why violence must be left on the table is because there may be a threshold beyond which violence is necessary. Because maybe, for example, media coverage at all is simply impossible. Maybe positive media coverage is impossible. Maybe the media is slanted in such a way as even if you have a nonviolent protest, it simply is intractable regardless. Maybe your community is so small, a nonviolent protest simply means you're invisible. Or maybe there are forces that override democratic ones that are, for example, running over your land with pipelines and bulldozers, so on and so forth. That media coverage, even despite being entirely positive, maybe there's an entire media empire sort of built around condemning that kind of thing. Nonetheless, it's inefficacious in actually stopping it. Maybe under those cases, you actually have to engage in violence to physically stop the progress of that machinery, and so on and so forth.
Also, to a point that we had earlier about the martyrdom strategy, why is it that police respond violently to peaceful protesters when it happens? I think
The smart ones don't.
Well, the smart ones don't.
Smart ones don't, because they know it's going to make them look shitty.
But what conditions?
Do you think the cops look good nowadays? Like, do you think
I'm
people
not
are
saying
generally...
that. Wait. Let me finish. What I'm saying is that in order for there to be a disproportionate police response, there needs to be a reputation or thought that these protesters are violent, that they are going to cause mayhem in the streets. This is the kind of thing that will prompt a disproportionate reactionary response from the police. If the police don't, if the police know that the protesters are not going to do anything, then what are they going to do? They're just going to handle them with kid gloves, and then the protesters are going to gain nothing. This martyrdom strategy then like relies on the existence of violent flanks, because violent flanks are what make the possibility of like they create the possibility of the disproportionate police response that you want.
Are you arguing that
I don't know if that's necessarily
we're not
true.
violent enough that the police will actually treat us better? That'd be a terrible world where the police treat protesters well. What a horrific outcome! Where police are treating protesters with kid gloves. What a horrific dystopian outcome!
Your whole point was that the martyrdom strategy is the best way of getting like social movements towards their objectives, right? So if you're serious about that, if you are serious about the martyrdom strategy, then you will be relying on the violence of certain fringe flanks in order to change your reputation.
Well, I would like to hear. I heard just a moment after you're done speaking. I'd like to hear from Professor Meat and from Doe as well. They both spoke up and have spoken less. But go ahead.
I'll be concise as possible. Like, martyrdom is one effective strategy. There are many others. When it comes to talk about civil resistance, there are very historically effective ways. There are protests in the streets that we think of mostly, but there's also stayaways. There's slowdowns. There's all sorts of kinds of ways.
If I may very quickly, just very quickly before if I can interfere just very quickly before we proceed to the two, and I'll be quiet.
5 seconds.
The problem, the Wick, is that the protests in the streets that you're referring to, they are either going to be passive when they encounter police, or they are not going to be. If the police, for example, simply do not engage in violence against the protesters, your martyrdom strategy fails because there's no active martyrdom.
Okay.
That's not true at all.
Professor Meat, please go right ahead. You opened your mouth.
I'm sorry, guys. I'll be real quick, and then you guys can go all you want. I'm just here to back up my buddy Wick. But no, I appreciate it. The only thing I was going to say is that I was going to point out is that the point of the martyrdom strategy, the reason the martyrdom strategy works, and part of why I don't think it's sort of a mischaracterization to say the martyrdom is like creating victims, not realistically in my mind, because the point of martyrdom ideally is to put on display malpractices, injustices that are happening on a daily basis, right? You're like in the case of ML in the civil rights movement, these are people, at least ideally, theoretically, who are like in a population who is going to be doled out injustice to them, who are electing to be the ones who it is done to so that it can be seen, right? And so that specific brand of martyrdom, you're right, isn't always possible. You can't always rely on the cops beating you up, but that's not the only way to put on display the negative circumstances that you're trying to protest against.
And likewise,
I've seen some other ways. Sorry, I've seen some other ways. Like some people do die-ins. If you've ever seen a die-in before, where they pretend to die on the floor. Most of the time, I've seen people talk about those. They laugh about them because they say like, "Oh, you guys are pretending like you have something that's so bad that's happening to you, but really you're fine because look, you're still alive. Things are still okay." Like that's.
Yeah,
that's part of that.
Like,
so
this poses a problem for.
I just want to defend my. No, I want to defend my. I guess it's Just Stop Oil, right? Because again, like, yeah, the cops are pretty well behaved with them most of the time, but they get a lot of attention, even if they just do a die-in. And what usually happens is it's not so much about making the protesters look good. It's because again, civil rights protesters were not favored by the American public, but the legislation was favored. Same with Just Stop Oil, because usually you'll get the default response from the average person to Just Stop Oil is, "Oh, I hate those hippies, but also climate change is actually a big deal." Shit.
Yeah, but the thing is that Just Stop Oil supplements the sillier things that it does with like really extreme things. Like I think recently, a couple protesters went to jail for multiple years or got sentenced to go to jail for multiple years because they got up on top of a bridge and stopped traffic across it for hours.
They were acquitted of that, I believe.
Sorry, they were acquitted.
It's the case I'm thinking of. There was recently a case where they were put on trial to go to jail for possible years for obstructing traffic, but they were acquitted.
It
might be a different one. It might be a different.
It's kind of immaterial. Good for them, but nonetheless, yeah.
The point is that they do both, right? They do more extreme things than just the violence, right?
Blocking traffic is
that would typically be
blocking traffic. Hang on. We'll slow down. Blocking traffic is very easily and often is construed as violence. Blocking traffic prevents people from getting food, from getting to the hospital. People die when traffic is blocked. Yeah, that's not a laughing matter.
So by this, so if I block, hold on. Here's the thing. I would say that, for example, anti-abortion protesters trying to block access to abortion clinics for when people are trying to get in. I would say that that's violent protest because you are trying to obstruct somebody, specifically the person trying to get an abortion, from getting something that is like that they medically want, right? Do you not think of that as violent in any way?
The problem is if you define violence that broadly, then everything becomes violence. Like consuming almond milk is violence. Have you seen those supply chains? They're pretty fucking uneven and like coercive. So yeah, but the problem when it comes to at least, sorry?
I said, why dismiss that?
Because the good thing about language is that like we all basically
No,
mean
the good
same
thing about
when we say
language learner
words.
box. No, the good
Like,
thing about language learner box
like, the
is that we
reason
can
that
take.
you
Hang
can-
on. The
Okay.
good thing about language learner box is that we can take an expanded category and then we can particularize it. So we can say, yes, in fact, violence takes place with a myriad of different types of activities that aren't equivalent to the physical breaking of another human being's skin. And then we can particularize corporeal violence, physical violence against bodies, violence against property, et cetera, et cetera.
No,
This
this
doesn't
is
present the problem.
it's making it harder to communicate. When I have
What
to
about this wasn't
explain,
clear?
when I want
Because
it to
then
be
that means-
very
because that
clear.
means- that
when
means
I go
MLK
to
was
someone
violent, right?
and I say,
But
hey,
when you- but
I've
when you
had
explain-
violence
but
been
when you have
against
to-
me, I need them to understand
when
what I
you-
mean. I don't need
but
them
when
to
you
ask
yes, but
questions.
when
Well, did
but
someone
when you
block your
say
traffic?
when you say
Did they
but when you
cut
say
you
but
off?
when you say
Wait.
but when you say a protest is violent, you and somebody asks how so, you will have to explain in what manner they were violent, and what you will say is
Only
did they
because the
murder a
compulsion-
person? Hang
that
on.
is
Did
only
they
a
murder?
problem.
Hang on. Did they murder a person? No, they broke a window. Well, hang on. I thought violence was just harm against persons. Yeah, well, the property is an extension of the person. It's their livelihood, et cetera, et cetera. You're playing the exact same game.
That's
No,
not true
but
at all.
when you look at the majority of the literature, like violence is either destruction of property or attacking people. That's it. Like, you can broaden
But
that
that
if you want.
involves
There
that
are,
exact
there
same
are
level of
situations.
abstraction,
Hold on.
Letterbox.
But then the
That's
problem is,
not
but then
what,
the problem is we've just been having a whole discussion about whether MLK was non-violent, and you know, that people generally agree
you're
that
making the
his whole
same
philosophy is
conceptual
non-violence.
move.
They're like, oh, but is boycotting bus services not violent because they bankrupted businesses? Yeah,
first-
you could say that, but then we
I-
can't communicate. Then we're just grunting at each other.
As Sunday
That's
said
not
at
true.
the
I don't
beginning.
think that's true at all.
I also
No,
have no
it's
problem with.
completely
I
true.
also have no problem with biting that bullet. I have no problem with characterizing that as violent. That costs me nothing. That
It
serves my
does
side
though.
just
You.
fine.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Yes,
Wait,
it is
if
a
I
problem.
if I could
It
if I
doesn't,
could
though.
if I could interject briefly.
Please.
The moment you step away from anything done against another human body as violence and towards property damage also constitutes violence, you open up a gradient. Blocking traffic can impede people from accessing vital services. Striking as a worker can disrupt supply lines that people rely on to live. I don't know if there's an objective answer to where exactly, like the word violence, capital V violence, but to avoid the semantic discussion, I think unless you disagree, I think we can acknowledge the ambiguity of the gradient, and we can just specify what kind of violence we're referring to. Better that than back and forthing over whether or not this or that the other.
Sure.
My definition, and we can agree on this or not. You can, if we want to argue about this, we can. But my definition: physical to other people, breaking of skin violence, or direct property damage, like direct, not indirect.
Okay, but that or property damage though introduces exactly the same gradient that me.
No, it doesn't.
Joe-
We don't have
yes,
to
it does.
follow
Hang
the
on.
string all the way down. We
Calm
can just
down,
say
Wick.
we're stopping
Calm
here.
down.
We're doing it again.
Me, Doe, and Sirius are perfectly fine with accepting that there is a gradient of violence that includes these other things, and that violence can have different levels of severity depending on your perspective and depending on your values, et cetera, et cetera. There's no contradiction there whatsoever. However, when you're introducing an abstraction that is personal property that is perhaps very distant from the person, maybe some personal property of the wealthy, for example, may be so infinitesimal, even though so large compared to the average person, that its destruction doesn't even register to them until long after the event. They simply don't care. And yet, nonetheless, it can be used adequately to characterize a protest as violent or non-violent, depending on like whether or not there's a picture of a smashed window that can be put on the news. Right? Like a bank losing its window does not hurt the bank in any meaningful capacity. And yet, nonetheless, that can be used to characterize a protest movement carried out by a people who are actively being choked out from having access to essential services.
That's because people are going to categorize that violence in the same way that Wick is categorizing it.
Absolutely.
Because they're going to see the broken window and they're going to say that's direct violence.
Okay, so then isn't the problem then that we're just ceding the framing to the other side? Like that seems to be a huge part of the problem here, is that
you can
we're just
say that
conceding that it's
framing-
violence.
you can say that framing. Well, you can. The word doesn't matter. The point is that that's what people care about. That thing.
Well, no,
we can call it something. We can call it something other than violence. We call it flubgub for all I care. The point is that there's this
No,
thing that Wick
that's-
was called.
That's not true. Hold on, that's not true. Professor Meat, it's just not true that the word doesn't matter.
What do you
Because
mean? Hold on.
Serious. The problem is
Hold
that
on.
you guys are trying to go against a fucking like ages-long tradition of when we talk about the difference between non-violence and violence and protest, we typically mean violence being destruction of property and attacking people, and non-violence being like civil disobedience. That's,
I mean,
and you guys are coming and trying to change the definitions.
By ages long, you don't actually mean that long. We haven't particularized it that long.
Because if we, the problem with the problem I have with
if you're
like,
just kind of
we're
stating that, that's
we're
not.
also moving away from it
true.
in the literature. Like in the literature, they're moving away from violence versus non-violence precisely because it's so subjective and fuzzy. Like,
and it's a
they're-
mistake. They're doing it, and that's a mistake.
No,
if
but
they
hang
are.
on. No, just an obvious counter to what Loner Box is saying that demonstrates it's not true is that in political science since Weber, we've been characterizing the state's legitimacy as being by dint of its legitimate monopoly on physical
When
violence.
I specifically say that-
However, at no point is it required that the state be actively engaging in violent corporeal action against human bodies at any single moment for it to have that legitimacy. We understand violence as, for example, existing in potentia.
People don't.
We do not talk about
People
violence as
don't.
involving simply the
This is-
destruction of
okay.
human bodies and or property. That's
This is a
inaccurate.
problem, if I may, just real quick, without interruption.
No. If
This
you're
is
going to make a
problem.
claim, if you're going to make an appeal to the traditional use of the term, you
No,
have
can
to
I
actually
respond
appeal
to-
to
yeah,
a
no, can I
source.
respond
I'm
to
not
what-
seeing one.
Keep talking over me.
Can I respond to what Sunday said? I was like, when I say in the literature, I mean specifically in discussions about political violence versus non-violence. Obviously, if you're
But
reading
that's
fucking Foucault,
that's literally what I'm
obviously-
referring to, like the
No,
father of
like-
sociology saying this.
No, I mean like contemporary literature when it discusses violence and non-violence. That's a bit different.
Contemporary
right?
literature is
No,
what we are
because-
referring to.
Yeah.
Contemporary literature is what we are referring
Okay,
to when we say that
so-
it does not refer specifically to corporeal violence against skin and buildings.
So when people are when all these papers talk about like MLK and non-violence, even though he did things that literally got
Yes,
fucking bus companies bankrupt,
colloquial in newspapers, peaceful
and in the
protest,
literature on violence
peaceful-
and non-violence.
again,
The literature
That's
is
incorrect.
far
You're
beyond
actually
what
just
saying
incorrect.
there,
I'm
Box.
sorry.
So here's the thing.
yeah,
Leonard
if you're
Box,
reading
is that
fucking
it's
Foucault,
changing.
yeah, everything's
It's-
violent.
No,
No,
we're actually
it's
reading the
not
same
just
sources as
Foucault.
Wick.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the issue. When you want to communicate to someone like what's going on, and you tell the average
What's
Joe
Foucault's
or
position on
Sally-
violence, Loner Box?
Is average Joe or
How does
Sally, I don't
Foucault
care about
define
Foucault.
violence?
Foucault is one person.
I hate
I'm trying to
Foucault.
talk to everyone. I'm
You
trying
never
to
read
talk to as
Foucault.
many people as possible. And the vast majority of people out there, and I will die on this hill, if you say, hey, my
You will.
movement is violent, they think of two things. They think of breaking windows, and they think of, well, breaking windows, burning
Well,
cars. property
clearly
damage.
not. Half the
And they think
debate
of-
panel does not agree with that.
I'm
Hold on,
going to
to-
tell you,
to-
I'm an average Joe. I'm not in an ivory tower somewhere, dude.
To Wick's point and to what you said earlier, Sirius, like the reason I say the word doesn't matter is because if all of a sudden you called breaking people's windows something other than violent and you put it on the news, the fact that it was not being called violence is not what is determining whether or not people like
That's
it. or disapprove
actually
it or
that's
approve it.
completely untrue. That's the thing. Like we have done experiments on this where the exact same events are framed as either violent or non-violent, and people's perception of the legitimacy of the protesters
Yes,
changes.
I am sure that if you frame something as violent versus non-violent, framing it as violent is going to
But that's what you're appealing
that's
to
what
when
I'm
you're saying that
what
the
I'm
optics
saying
are what
is-
matters.
What I'm saying is the quality that Wick is referring to. What I'm trying to say
Is
is that
optical.
Yeah, the words that
it's
you
not
use
purely
influence
optical. It's not
people's-
purely optical. Even in those scenarios, the bulk of the things that people are going to decide on whether or not they approve of it or disapprove of it is going to be the invocation of the underlying qualia, right? People care about violence acts. We can call it. Yeah,
What's
like
the
the
underlying
character-
qualia? What are you
the
talking about?
the characteristics of the definition.
That's not
Whatever-
what-
That's not what qualia means. I have no idea what you're saying.
Sure. Do you really have no idea what I'm saying when I say the characteristics of the definition?
Do you not
Yes,
see
I
the
have no
difference
idea what
between
you're
punching
saying.
someone in the face and
You don't know
blocking
what the
traffic?
the sentence
Do you-
characteristics of the
do you
definition.
not-
Yeah, I
Okay,
could-
wait,
I
wait,
actually-
wait,
understand the
wait.
difference.
Hold on, because we ended up doing it anyway. I think the problem here is that the selective framing of certain actions as violent or not, and the subjectivity of that determination has literally been a tool of social control for as long as we've had mass media. So appealing to or even attempting to work out where exactly something falls in this line that is deliberately kept arbitrary to reaffirm the values of whoever gets to determine whether or not it is seems really counterproductive. we're obviously talking about a distinction between violence and social violence. There are plenty of theorists who speak on these issues who would happily side on either side of this issue, and we can also agree, I think, that whether or not something optically plays well and whether or not it's academically sound are two entirely separate questions. I'd be far more interested if we specifically referred to what kinds of violence or not we're talking about when we talk about what is justified. Whether we're talking about breaking windows directly, strike action, deploying supply lines, whatever we mean, because I think we could do this particular bit forever, you know?
Well, violent protest can involve, for example, the destruction of government property, attempting to bulldoze a traditional.
I just want the specific acts being referred to over what could otherwise be an interminable discussion.
When I think about
it's going to depend. It's just all going to depend on the context of the specific social movement. Like, there is no one size fits all for every social movement.
Can we make one for this discussion, though? Can we make a one size fits all?
Why would we? Because it changes based on time too.
Because
so, like,
what's going to happen is you're going to change it based on what it fits your argument. That's what's going to happen.
No, that's not what.
We're going to chase this dog all the way down.
Here's the thing. Even the scholars.
Hang on. I've got an interesting.
Moderator.
I've got an interesting question for the panel. I am curious about people's take on this. So I think we would generally agree that that there's a rising tide of transphobia in this country, as well as generally anti-feminist sentiment, et cetera, et cetera. Can anyone tell me in which province there was a stabbing of a feminist professor in the last month?
No.
I read the article, but I don't remember the province.
In Canada?
Same here.
Yeah.
I think I heard about that.
And how much did that?
Canada, I don't care.
How much wind did that take out of the sails of conservative reactants against
None.
trans issues? None.
What's your point?
That is my point.
So,
That is
again,
the point.
isolated
Wind out of the
incident.
sails.
If the targeted community, unless
changing minds, an argument.
Unless the targeted community is not held in contempt, it lacks the capacity to change minds by passively accepting its oppression.
Yeah, you gotta have better evidence.
Well, that is kind of true. Like even like at the time it happened, Emmett Till didn't get that much attention at all. But then 10 years later, everyone's paying attention. But I could say if we're talking about
feminist professors, I mean, I think.
But if we're also talking about like how much did January 6th damage the Republican Party? They've been fighting each other ever since on that. So.
Well, although to be clear,
depends, you know,
as far as violent protests are concerned, very few deaths, very little property damage.
Yeah, but it was still everyone here. I hope would consider that violent.
Wait, why? Why was
But hang on. Wait.
What if property was violent?
No. But slow down. What if
PTSD and someone died? That's why it's violent.
Yeah, absolutely. But what if that didn't happen? What if they just walked in? Maybe someone shat on a desk. What then? Would that not be violent still? I would consider that violent. That's a direct
reference to freedom of the entire
country.
Breaking into a building is probably violence, yeah.
Well, no, I disagree with you, Box. I think if they were peaceful and
or
they
like the vandalism,
and not vandalized and not hurt anyone, it would have. No, if I'm telling you right now, if they had come in, they had not vandalized anything, they had not hurt anyone, and they were simply peaceful, that would be looked on much differently. Are you kidding me? That would be looked on much differently by the public than it is now. Yeah,
I don't
absolutely.
know.
It's silly, but it would be way more favorable than what they did.
Yeah, are you arguing against that? Do you disagree?
I mean, I didn't know about the cops being killed until long after. I knew about the person who was climbing the walls.
That's because you weren't paying attention. That was like day of stuff.
I was watching it live day of. There was no coverage of that.
Well, sure, but that doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't change the fact that Wick's example, like the example of someone going in and taking a shit, would be viewed would have way less of a disruptive effect on the Republican Party.
Yeah, I don't understand this point that you're trying to make.
Party.
Obviously, if January 6th was less violent, it would have been viewed more favorably.
No, you're missing the point. There's survivorship bias here in terms of what you consider to be a successful protest. You are identifying the ones that people cared about, and therefore they're accepting their oppression and being covered by the media in such a manner as their oppression actually became existent to the people observing it who weren't part of that protest. That depends on so many different things that most people in the world do not have.
Also, too,
I would.
Do you think
agree to that? That most movements don't succeed? Yeah, I'll agree to that.
Okay, but
that's
if most
regardless of violence or
movements
not.
don't succeed,
That's
if most movements don't
regardless
succeed,
of violence or not.
if most movements don't succeed, and what percentage do you suppose those movements are violent? Like
so
we
in
have a
successful
handful of
movements by
cases
Erica
to
Chenoweth,
draw.
we have data on this, and you can you dispute the data if you'd like, but we have data from Erica Chenoweth, and you've been sent the sources.
Your author
You should know the
disputes
sources.
the data.
The non-violence.
Yes,
is
your
more
author disputes the
efficacious.
data.
Hi.
Your author disputes the data you are citing. Go on,
Wick,
Cedric.
I wanna point your attention to Erica Chenoweth, like her own characterization of her data. Like she has put out tables showing the difference over time between the success rates of violent versus non-violent protests. And if we see it changed over time, not after World War II even. So the 1940
It
to
did,
19
though, after World War II. It
Okay.
steadily non-violence became more and more and more effective.
Yeah, but for those first few decades after World War II, or rather these first couple decades, violent was more effective. So it's not to say that nonviolent is never effective. It's that it depends on the time and place and the conditions that you're in. Moreover, I want to point you to something else, which is that Erica's data has been analyzed by other people, which, that's good because her data set is huge and extensive, and I applaud her for that. But one thing is that when it was broken down by race, like the racial makeup of the protests, there was no strategic advantage to nonviolence when when it was a movement by a minority or disadvantaged population. Violent protests and non-violent protests had the same success rate for minority groups.
So even in the worst case scenario where a group is despised, non-violence or violence has no appreciable benefit towards non-violence, is what you're saying to me right now.
Yep.
Except in the most famous cases, it actually does, and is
In the most
co-constitutive of a
famous
positive
cases,
effect.
what does that even mean?
Well, Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha movement in particular, the decision, the success of that movement was also predicated on its contrary, which was the attack on British officers by the Indian National Army. Yeah. What
So
you're probably putting your finger on is that in a
world-
situation, what you're probably putting your finger on, Wick, and I think we would agree on this, in a situation in which you have the capacity for positive media coverage, in which you are at some level of closeness with the powers that be, you are part of, for example, you are immediate subjects of the city in which those authorities reside, and so on and so forth. Nonviolent action has a greater effect when you have that type of relationship with the given authorities. But when we're talking about, there are a myriad of other cases in which that isn't the case, in
So-
which nonviolent
Do you
action
think
You're
simply
close.
means.
Let me answer this real quick because
I'm
you're
close to
close,
what?
right? Because one of the goals of a civil resistance movement is to ingratiate themselves with the populace, to ingratiate themselves with the pillars of power which support any kind of structure which they're trying to change.
Oh, that's
So-
not true.
That's not,
That-
To
that's not
ingratiate
true. It really
themselves,
is.
that's not true at all. That's very
What are you
incorrect.
talking about? That's just
What are they
the pillars-
protesting against?
They may not want to ingratiate themselves. For
They
example,
want to make the people, because pillars of power that support a regime, an institution, a country, a society, all of them are run by people.
did
And
we
so,
want to
again, we
ingratiate
know-
ourselves to
Yeah,
the
but
British when we
slave
were
holders are
separated
people
from them?
too, Wick.
What are you talking about? We went to war with slave. They ingratiated themselves with the North, and we went to war and we
Yeah, that's
killed
not a
them.
protest. That's war. That's
Yeah, we killed them. We killed the slave owners, or we tried to.
But you still had whites-only institutions and
Sure,
places.
it took a while because 400, at the time.
But who are they
Hundreds of
ingratiating
years of
themselves
protest.
towards? I don't follow
So
you here exactly.
So it's important.
No, but at some
Well,
point,
let me
at some
explain it.
point,
If
the
you let
motive
me
was not
explain it,
ingratiation.
maybe you would understand, but you gotta let me finish. So what happens is, what you want to do is, let's take the 1978 Iran revolution, which was nonviolent. It's not often seen as nonviolent,
Oh,
but it was
that's
absolutely
incorrect, my
nonviolent.
friend. That is very incorrect, my
Okay,
friend.
how many did they kill, the Iranian protesters?
The Iranian
How many did they
protesters-
kill? Yeah, how many did they kill?
I don't know.
I thought we also said
None. They
destruction
didn't
of
kill
property.
anyone. They didn't
Just-
kill anyone because it was non-violent. You absolute moron. Okay, so let me educate you here a little.
I thought we said
the reason that worked.
I thought we said that property
I gotta answer. I
destruction
gotta
also
talk about
counted as
the reason
violence.
this reason this works, right, is because the oil producers, the oil workers, they
Are you talking about
did what was
Mossadegh?
called a slowdown.
Hang on,
okay?
sorry.
No,
refresh
Mossadegh's
me. Which-
50s.
Yeah, that's
We're talking
different.
about the
Different
revolution in
thing.
the 70s.
Different thing.
Okay, he did say the revolution. Sorry, I wanted to make sure. I wouldn't
70.
know if he said revolution or after that. Because
78.
Mossadegh, I would kind of
79?
get where he's coming from, but there were other problems with that. If he's talking about the Iranian Revolution of 1979, no, they fucking wasn't bloodless. Are you insane?
What are you talking about? So again, the reason that it worked, well, it wasn't bloodless because the authorities at the time killed the protesters, and they would have a funeral and protest. So yeah,
Between
the state did
1963 and
violence,
1979, he estimated 3,164 in the anti-Shah movement were killed. The Foundation of Martyrs identified 744 dead in Tehran, where the majority of the casualties were supposed to have occurred. The coroner's office counted 895 dead, and Tehran's main
Okay,
cemetery.
3,000
They were
in
going
how many
against
years?
like a
How many
Gestapo
years?
type secret police. This was not.
No,
this was
when
not
we
a
talk about
bloodless revolution.
when we talk about non-violent, I think he means the actions of the protesters,
Yes,
not against the
protesters. I
state
don't care
they're
about the
protesting
state.
against,
The state
right?
is going to. So even
Yeah,
so
they didn't
this-
have a dogmatic attitude towards violence
my God.
that kept it off the table. I don't
who-
think
They did though. Okay.
Whose
so the reason it
definition
worked-
are you using of nonviolence? Are you still using Erica's? Because
Just be specific. Be careful here.
Well, because in Erica Chenoweth's book, like you can read her footnotes, and specifically she says that the violence versus nonviolence distinction for that book is about whether or not there was an armed subset, or whether or not they were predominantly armed. So that doesn't line up with the colloquial definition that we're using, right?
Well, I'm just
Again,
for
what
whatever
does
it's
this
worth.
have to
I'm
do with my point?
Yeah, for whatever it's worth, I'm going through like
What it has to
I've
do with
read,
the
like,
point is that-
hold on. This is directly relevant to what. Just a quick clarification to make. Like, it could be the case that there was some violence from the revolutionaries going on at some level, but this is a little bit like I'm going through like it's paper after paper after page after page of people like overwhelmingly unanimously by historians. It seems to be the case that the Iranian Revolution that we're referencing was considered overwhelmingly peaceful. I mean, articles about how one of the primary tactics that the people used was to go out and confront the soldiers and like literally speak to them and try to get them to come to their side. And it was at one point it was like over 1,000 people per day were defecting from the military police. It's like
they were ingratiating themselves into the pillars of power, and it was fucking successful. And this rewriting of history that we're trying to do, right, is just wild to me. When we have this documented, it's recorded. We can go and we can look at it. What broke the people is when the police who were pulling, the security forces were pulling people out of their homes to go work in the oil factory or the oil refinery or whatever it was called. They stopped doing that. They refused to obey. That is the purpose of getting people, of ingratiating yourselves into these pillars of power, is so that the pillars of power who would otherwise support the regime or the country or the institution stop doing so, not necessarily by defecting, though that would be great, but by simply not obeying, not complying, being non-compliant. That is the purpose. That's what works. That's what happens. I don't understand why you are fighting me on this.
Well,
This is
because
just
it's not
true.
the strategy of every single protest movement. I think that
Of course, it's not the strategy of. I'm saying when they do use this
We're
as
talking
a
about
strategy,
predominant.
it
You
is
can
more
use the
likely
word
to be
predominant,
successful
right?
when they don't.
So, but okay, that's not always true though, because what if
It's
your
not
entire
always
Wick,
true, but it
Wick,
generally is
Wick,
true.
Wick, are you going to let me speak? Is that these things are conditional on specific circumstances, and I think one instructive case is the South Sudanese like separatist or independence movement. Because when you look at that kind of thing,
The seizure of the American embassy by Islamic militants in November 1979, the consequent hostage crisis, and above all, the Iranian-Iraq war began in September 1980, strengthened the Islamic Republic because of the rally around flags and Trump. This was not a non-violent protest, Wick. You were incorrect on this.
We're talking about predominantly.
Crisis. This is
Sunday,
fundamentally
it's
It's
different.
about
than
being
what-
predominantly like.
Sunday, you interrupt.
you're sort of. I think Sunday you're sort of doing the same thing that people do about MLK about BLM. Protests, where they say,
right?
BLM, where they say, oh well, they point to violent things that did happen and they try to characterize the protest.
Well,
as
that's
that.
because the violent things were done by the movement.
No, I love it that we fought so hard
It's-
against
it
the
was
right
a
wingers being like,
minority.
mostly peaceful. Look at all these riots, and we're like, no, it's mostly peaceful. But now when it comes to the other side, it's like, oh, actually, like this mostly peaceful movement was really
I'm
violent.
not.
because-
I wouldn't
We're
say
doing-
that they
we're
were
doing
mostly
the-
peaceful.
you're doing
That's
it right
what I'm
wingers talking about
saying.
BLM.
Well, hang on.
Mostly-
I
but
wouldn't say.
that's the thing. We don't want to concede the. You guys want to concede the. Oh, sorry.
I wouldn't characterize BLM as nonviolent. I would characterize BLM as being besmirched in the sense of being characterized as sort of barbaric and sort of wantonly violent against persons in the street. But I wouldn't characterize them as nonviolent. They are intrinsically.
Would you characterize it as predominantly violent?
What did I just say, Professor Meat?
I'm asking the clarifying
I was
question.
literally
Would you-
just saying. I was literally just saying it's intrinsically violent.
Oh, what?
Okay, well,
No.
the reason I asked the clarifying
No.
question is because I don't think any reasonable person believes that, except maybe some far right Republicans. No one.
Rob Norris
Well,
in my
no.
chat cheering you on.
It
Rob
wasn't
Norris like,
predominantly
yes,
violent.
yes, Queen, yes.
No, because violence
BLM was
encompasses.
inherently
Well,
violent.
no.
He's in here
No.
cheering you on right now.
No, sir. Are you
violence
going?
weren't
Hang
even
on.
realistically
Wait,
protesters.
Wick.
All right.
Wick. No. Hang on 1 sec, Wash. I'm so sorry. Wick, you yourself would characterize violence against property as being violence. Destruction of property is
But
violence. Yes.
even under
Or
that
would you deny that
characterization,
BLM
was
riots involve
primarily
violence against
nonviolent.
property?
Even under that prior characterization, I would consider
No. The
BLM
destruction of property is inherently violent. We are in agreement
yes,
on this.
and
Everyone
most
here is in
BLM
agreement on
protests,
this.
They didn't destroy, they didn't blow shit up. They didn't burn things. They didn't break windows.
What are you talking
Most
about? That was the
BLM
entire.
protests did not-
That was the
that did not
basis of
occur.
Rittenhouse. That was the basis of Rittenhouse even being in Kenosha. He was defending property because property was being destroyed. What are you smoking?
No one's saying
Again,
riots
just
didn't
because it
happen.
happened
Wait,
in
sorry.
one
No,
off.
we all wait. We all agree on this. BLM protests were mostly peaceful. Some of them were riots, right? We all agree.
Absolutely.
But you
Okay,
can say that
fuck
about
me.
literally
No,
every
that's
single
not
That's
true.
all we
Sorry.
get to. And they
I'm sorry,
dropped in popularity when the riots
I interrupted the
dominated
moderator.
the media,
My
right?
apologies.
Okay, but when they dominated the media, right? Not when
I
like
got
they
the
were
order
at
back.
their most prominent, but when the media started to focus on them and like characterize them as violent. No?
I mean, it does.
the
Like when a
right-wing
riot
media.
happens, people are going to cover it. Of course, even if you're like, even CNN. Remember, CNN got like they looked so stupid with this reporter saying mostly peaceful protest with a burning building behind them. Like media is going to do that. It's a riot. Of course, people want to see a riot on TV. Like,
Yeah, so and then what happens when like the media invites you on to talk about like your movement, right? In the wake of a riot, do you go up there and you're like, oh well, these people, you know, these are the bad ones. Like I hate them. Like we need to make a concerted effort to not have so many violent protests. Like
As Vosh
So-
referenced, as the moderator referenced earlier, MLK gave us a very good playbook for this. He condemned the riots, but also condemned the underlying conditions which caused the riots. He used this as an opportunity
How much ink
not
did
only
he-
to distance himself from the violence, but also to reiterate into his audience the conditions which he was protesting.
how much ink did he give to one versus the other?
What
quite
do
a
you mean?
lot.
How much ink did he?
He
Like,
spent quite a
there
lot
are
of time.
books that were
Well,
primarily
regardless of-
Proportionally. How
Regardless
how
of
much
ink,
did
he spent so many man hours. Like this was like one of the most fundamental parts of like I don't want maybe training is the wrong word, but the type of discipline that he
Okay, no.
instilled to his
I'm not
protesters.
talking about training. I'm talking about when he was like making speeches to people.
Yeah.
Sure,
Because
but mostly
you even see that
nonviolent.
speech that he
interview.
gave. You
I'm
can even
not
see
say-
like because the philosophy of nonviolence was like essential to him, and it's like you can even see the speech where he said like if every black man in America or every black person in America came out in favor of violence, I would stand against them and say this is wrong. Yeah, he was pretty passionate in that direction. But again, I don't think I disagree with you. He said, yeah, we condemn the violence. That's not what we're about. Back to civil rights issues. Is that?
But he went out of his way to do it
sorry,
still.
wait, serious. Do you disagree with any of that as a strategy?
With what as a strategy? With like
With
saying
you seem to be, you've done it like 3 times now. It's like you seem to be very like you don't seem very sure about how to respond. Like if you're on TV asked to condemn the riots or whatever, but it seems like it's pretty simple to just be
if
yeah,
you
we
just
condemn
say
the
I
riots. We don't
condemn,
stand
I
for that.
condemn the
Let's
riots,
talk
and
about-
then well, yeah, but that's the thing is that I don't think that I don't mind doing something like that strategically. What I mind is that is like this incessant focus on it. If you're going to like give a quick condemnation of the riots, whether strategically or because you really believe that the riots are bad, then you should do it
Well,
quickly.
you should be,
and
if I
then-
may, you should be very particular, right? So, for example, if you're going on TV and you say, I condemn the riots, and you are not aware that the media has portrayed the protests categorically as
Yeah.
riots. Well, and that is being used to condemn the peaceful protests as well. You have to be very particular. You have to say, oh, I am unaware, for example, of people doing X, Y, and Z, throwing grenades into squads of cops or whatever, and I condemn that, of course. And most of us aren't doing that. That's one thing. And of course, like, there's nothing wrong with if being asked, like, are you in favor of your movement eating babies? Of saying, we don't do that, but of course I am, obviously. But when you're talking about, like, do you condemn the riots, quote unquote, and the movement as a whole is being characterized as riots, and adjacent movements are being looped in as riots? Of course, you would be foolish.
I also don't know what you mean by it being this like incessant attacks on riots and like nothing. I don't know exactly who's doing that. I mean, maybe I could even flip it the other way. It seems to be the case that when BLM was happening, the response on Twitter was like mostly people saying, "No, it's mostly peaceful. Fuck you." But yeah, there are some people in there.
We all
like,
agree.
Yeah, rioting's based.
But Loner Box,
yes.
hang on, Loner Box. We all agree that BLM is overall majority, like a peaceful, quote unquote. We can talk about the ambiguities about that
You
later.
just said like
No,
10
but we
minutes
all
ago that
agree.
it was inherently violent.
Yes, because I don't draw a parrot. I don't treat violence and nonviolence and peaceful as synonymous. Just like you, I'm actually the only reason why I'm allowing this is because I'm basing this off of what you said in your opening statement, Wick. Like we all agree though, the vast majority of people in BLM protests are not, for example, breaking windows or throwing rocks at cops, etc., etc. And yet, nonetheless, when you look at the news coverage of these protests, what is overwhelmingly shown are burning cop cars and broken windows and dark, like cities at night with the glow of fire in the air. Like, they absolutely characterize these things as riots.
But the problem wasn't showcasing that. The problem was, and I think the reason to answer Sirius is
You don't think the problem was exaggerating
let me
that?
Isn't that a
finish,
reason to be less violent?
You'll find out what I think the problem is in a moment here, if you let me. Right? Is that as the reason why it sometimes seems as if we're constantly harping on it, because every time we said we want to try, hey, we condemn the riots, we condemn the violence, let's talk about the issues, someone out there raises their hand and says, actually, I think the riots are based and we should do more of them. And then we have to deal with that chuckle fuck, right? And that's a problem.
Sure.
You have to deal with them.
I will also say,
You don't have to acknowledge them.
Sorry.
You can just keep talking.
When they exist, they will cause some level of problems to you.
again, I think it's probably good that when you have the opportunity to stand against rioting within your movement or excessive force and all that, like, yeah, you probably should do it. I don't know what's wrong with that. And actually, one of the big reasons the protests were mostly peaceful was that they did that. When people tried to antagonize and tried to be more provocative and try to smash it up, the protesters were they were so mean to them. Like they made sure that that's just what they didn't stand for that. And I think that's a good thing to do. Again, like, that's a specific thing. Do you disagree with that, Sirius?
No, I don't disagree with having discipline in a given protest action, but that's the problem I'm having is that violent protests, when they happen, don't tend to happen as the result of like this planned organized effort. They tend to be spontaneous. They tend to be unplanned. They tend to be organic. Like, these kinds of things will happen. And so it's one thing to say when you are in a movement circle and you are planning to have a protest that you want to instill a certain kind of discipline into your protesters. That's one thing. It's another thing to go out of your way to respond to what right-wingers say about your protest movement when the more violent flanks do their thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think we disagree then, right? Not really?
How not?
On that particular point, it doesn't seem to be.
I have a question, if I may. So, obviously, if we're talking about the optics and effectiveness of different types of protests, over here in America, most of our protests are nonviolent. Whereas if you're in, Syria, the only way to protest getting a pothole in your street fixed is by forming a militia and firing rockets at buildings. There's contextual determinations. The question I have is, where's the line? Or to put it another way, if you saw a protest starting peaceful and then it started to tip into violence, how far gone would things have to be for you to look at that and go, okay? Because it's easy to do that in retrospect, right? I mean, there are lots of protests that we get to look back on for lessons to learn, but we don't learn the important lesson, which was what should we have thought at the time? in America at the time of the civil rights protests, after all, the average person thought that the civil rights protests were a violent movement, that they were disruptive and disorderly. If we'd been listening to Optics Frogs back then, ones we would now disagree with in hindsight, we might have had a different answer. How do you judge? When is it okay to take a movement in that direction? Since we all agree there is a point, I just want to know where it is for you all.
So are
I
you
think it's when
asking,
there's-
for clarification, just so I know what you're asking, are you asking when we think it's morally justified that people get violent, or are you asking when we see something get violent, when should we rein it in?
Probably the former, I would say, because if you agree there's a point, and obviously it's a hypothetical, of course, you know, it's not like a tomorrow thing, but I guess I'm wondering what qualifiers you're looking for.
If I may very quickly, there's a famous cartoon that you will often see on the internet. I can't remember the name of it, but it shows Martin Luther King in front of a journalist. What the fuck is his name? Montgomery? I can't remember. There's Montgomery in the name somewhere. And it's a picture of Martin Luther King Jr. in front of a vast destruction, like a vast ruin of a city block. Okay. While he was active, Martin Luther King Jr.'s movement was not perceived by the general public as simply nonviolent. It wasn't even necessarily viewed as nonviolent by the vast majority of people. So one of the problems you're up against here is that your empirical data, despite the fact that, yes, we all concede to the data that says, however problematized their identity of violent versus nonviolent is, and however however various it is depending on the paper you're citing, there does seem to be, in particular conditions, advantages to nonviolent protests, and none of us would disagree. Obviously, nonviolent protests have succeeded in some cases. There are cases where it works. Nonetheless, if you're going to say that categorically nonviolent protest has an advantage in terms of optics, if your empirical cases, especially the major ones, did not actually have that optic while they were operative, that's a bit of a problem for
But
you. That kind of
that's-
removes your
It
empirical
did
basis.
have that cartoon you're referencing was a piece of right-wing propaganda that failed, though.
Yeah, it
like
didn't
that,
work.
That optic did work. Like that's why the thing that went all around the country, and even internationally, were those images of peaceful protesters getting beaten up by cops. That was the entire message. Was that these peaceful protesters who were all suited up and just trying to absorb the blows are just taking it. The
Hang
optics
on.
did
What
work.
is
And
your
actually,
what is your
even-
basis? What is your basis for saying that, though? You say it doesn't work, but
What did I say? It doesn't work.
The civil rights
The
movement was
propaganda
passed. Like the civil rights succeeded. That's what I mean.
Yeah, they got the legislation passed. This was like one of the most successful decades in like African American history. No?
I think that the appeals to international audiences is, I think, separate from how it was perceived in the United States itself, because what reaches overseas is not necessarily going to be like the propaganda that's influencing the average American person, because though amongst Americans,
I'm talking
MLK
about
was super unpopular.
He was,
Yeah, but his ideas
popularity
were
popular. His popularity got quite big towards 65, and then it dropped again after, because a lot of movements which were not
Vietnam
MLK's
War,
did
his
become
protest of
violent.
the
Yeah.
Vietnam War.
So the Vietnam protests, but no, the impression generally was that although you're right, most Americans didn't support the demonstrators at the time, especially like freedom riders and all that, but they still grew in favor of civil rights legislation, and the people they were more appalled by was the cops and the segregationists, because they were literally fucking burning buildings down, and like they blew up a church that got 4 black kids killed. Like that was what the people really condemned.
Yes, and let's not forget, right? Like there is
okay, but what
evidence-
you're pointing to, though, is that in the absence of that extreme violence, that not taking place, that's violence by the opposing side. But suppose that hadn't happened. Your argument
when
falls
it
flat in its
didn't-
face. Fortuitous,
No,
I
I said
suppose,
that-
those 4 black kids were killed. Your strategy
So
works.
it depends on which issue, right? The bus boycotts worked because no one used violence on either side. They just bankrupted a bus company, and then they were forced to desegregate. But no, you're right. Like Albany failed because the cops were being really strategic, and they didn't strike the protesters. So that's true. Yeah.
See,
like I mentioned that earlier.
This is
I
an
don't think
issue
they were
here,
even
is that
forced to desegregate.
The morality of the thing has.
Well, it was negotiated after the boycott, no?
One of the
I'm
problems we're
pretty
having,
sure the
especially-
negotiation was to bring it in line with other southern cities.
Which was desegregating, though.
One of the
No, it was not, because in Montgomery, it was specifically, there was a specific version of segregation in Montgomery. So in most other southern cities, it was seating whites front to back and blacks back to front. And then wherever you met in the middle, that was whatever, right? But in Montgomery, there was like a specific 10-person seating arrangement that was like a middle area where, which was supposedly for everyone, but Black people were asked to leave that middle area even when they had the right to be there. So like there was a very particular thing that they were fighting against. They didn't even fight for full desegregation of the buses. They fought for a different kind of
Well, what about the
segregation.
diner sit-ins? Let's
No,
look.
but it was
at the
no,
bus
it
boycotts
was
and
a
diner
it was a
sit-ins.
success. That bus boycott was considered a success at the time, though, wasn't it? They did push to get like the change without
it
violence on either
absolutely
side.
worked,
That's all I was saying.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah, no, I'm not right. Yeah, okay, sure.
My
sorry.
point is that it was really modest. It was not desegregation. It was a different kind of segregation.
They are so yes. Sometimes you don't get every single thing you want in the first time. It's an incremental process, and people don't like that. But incrementalism absolutely works, and it's slow and it's frustrating. But that's how you eat an elephant, one bite at a time. Okay, you don't try to shove it all down your throat all at once. But the problem we're getting into here is
What are
like
you talking about?
incrementalism and why it's based. So, but the problem we get into here is
hang on, no, but
but
Explain
Sirius
how
was
that-
just saying, well,
yes.
it only got some success. So can we really characterize it?
Yeah, I mean
as
that was true before the 50s as well. Before the
I'm not-
50s, they had Brown versus the Board of Education, which was that ruled segregation of schools unconstitutional. Yeah, there were loads of steps taken even before the 50s.
To be clear, I'm not saying it was unsuccessful. I was just disputing
And
what
what's your
what was
point?
said. I was correcting the record on what was being said about it. That it was a success in that it got the buses desegregated. It was not a success in that the buses got desegregated. It was a success in that they aimed for something pretty small
Brought it a
and they
step
ended up getting
closer
it.
to desegregation. Let's say that. How's that? Is that better?
Their broader goal. I mean, that was personally the broader goal of many of the movement leaders, but it wasn't the explicit strategy that they were employing. They were not going for that. They were not arguing for that to be the case. They were not asking for that. They were asking for a different kind of
Yeah,
segregation.
it was a first step in a larger plan and a larger movement to get eventually civil rights in general, right? And it's still, to be clear, right? I don't think that the civil rights movement and the civil rights era fully got 100% of what it wanted or what it needed. I think there's still work we need to do, but I think that we can point to it as
there's still
a
work we need
resounding
to do.
success.
What are you referring to? What do you have
overall.
in
No,
mind
wait,
here?
sorry.
Still
Like,
work we need to do.
the timeline is well serious. So the company did what you said, but then they actually did desegregate fully in
Okay.
56, right? So that's the incremental. Yeah.
All
so-
right, that's fair.
yeah, one
That's
thing
fair.
at a time. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a
I'm-
nice conversation, isn't it?
Did we ever get answers from the question that Vosh asked?
No, I have no
Oh, I was
goddamn
going to say
idea.
that if you have one. I wanted you at the threshold, right?
Yeah, at what
Um,
point? Because the reason I
give you a
asked
really-
this is
okay.
because the deference to public opinion isn't really a reliable metric in the time. Depending on which polls you go by, something like 80% of whites didn't think that protesting would help the blacks' cause back during the civil rights era. And I mean, in retrospect, we understand the protests were good anyway. But how do you make these determinations about whether or not any protest is viable or optically beneficial, or if violence is the right answer?
I think a really good example of that is Mandela, because I like citing those people because they're like very successful at what they did, right? Is that they tried nonviolence for a very long time, but it was only after every like other nonviolent avenue had been exhausted that they resort to violence. And that's usually because you get to a stage, whether it's like South Africa or Palestine or wherever, where violence basically becomes inevitable and you have to do something with it, which is what the ANC did. But that was, I mean, the threshold for that was like, I think Mandela adopted violence after the government forcibly removed 60,000 people from a village in neighborhood in Johannesburg because they thought they were making the city too black, which is an insane threshold, right?
I think
like
one of
forcibly
the-
removal.
one
of
So,
the
yeah.
one of the assumptions that's
I would
kind of
love to
undergirding
answer
a lot
the
of this, one of the assumptions that kind of undergirding a lot of this discussion is that nonviolence is efficacious, presuming that the protest is only against policy and not, for example, as in the case of the Iranian Revolution, against interference from some kind of colonial metropole. Your very country, not you, Lonerbox, of course, is established by means of very violent protest.
Oh, are you talking about the Revolutionary War, right?
am, yes.
Yes, I will see that prior to World War II, prior to the advent of mass media, the variables were changing.
No, of course, but
and-
you see the fundamental weakness of your position, though. You
Is
have
it?
to presume that the people who are protesting want the status quo to persist. But
Why? Why do I have to assume that? And I want to
Well,
answer
because the
Bosch's
power-
question.
because
to be
you're-
clear,
because
I'm
you're-
trying to
because
answer
you're
Bosch's
offering-
question, but
because
I
you're
have to deal
offering-
with you every time.
Well, no, because your arguments presume that all that is taking place is a shift in policy by the same
That's not
powers.
true. My
Yes, it is.
Even if you want leadership change, let's look at what happened in I think Serbia back in '98, where they basically ousted the leader who tried to steal the election. Basically, the Butcher of the Balkans at the time tried to basically steal the election entirely. And that protest, entirely nonviolent, keep in mind, was actually successful in regime change, which is far better and far more far more ambitious than simply policy changes. I'm talking about things where there's a secession of territory, like where occupation of a territory stops. Okay, these things work both on the policy level and also on the broader overhaul, more kind of revolutionary level, if you will. The problem is it works whether your cause is just or unjust. We see a lot of very fashy, very bad actors adopting a lot of the rules for radicals playbook and a lot of these the playbooks of the more nonviolent resistance, civil resistance, to success, right? To their benefit. And this is a problem that I think that researchers are dealing with nowadays, is that
But
these
he was
ways of going
he was
about
fought
it
with
are
military
effective
counteraction.
regardless of the morality of the thing. But I want to answer Vosh's question real quick before I forget, is that my line is when they are directly, basically it's a very high bar, I understand, but when they have removed all other means of change. So if they've prevented you can't vote anymore, they are putting you in camps, they are killing you, there comes a point where you just have to take up arms.
So after they've already succeeded in killing you is when we can start to
Well,
rise
you
up.
understand? Well, hang on, Sirius. You do need to remember the wise words of my prime minister: "When you kill your enemies, they win."
I mean, the problem with that argument is that you're assuming that violence would have saved people beforehand, which again is like that's kind of shaky, right?
I don't know. Is it?
Depends on what you're talking about. I don't really
I
know if
agree.
like
Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't really know
agree,
if
it depends.
right?
That's
I don't. Yeah, but let's say that stupid fucking Ben Shapiro thing about if the Jews were armed, they could have stopped the Holocaust. Well, I'm like, no. If there were fucking Jews running around in 1930s Germany killing people, what do you think the response? Oh, actually, I think Jews are okay now. We'll just chill with them. No, they would have got worse, like quicker. But I don't
Well, it
know.
couldn't have hurt.
I don't
dude.
hurt. I don't
At
think
the point,
I don't
at the
think
point where they're
situation
rounding
to
them
live
up
was
and
stored
at
out
the
as
point where they're
unlikely
rounding
or-
them up and putting them into a furnace, I'd say, give it a go.
Do you think
I
in
mean,
the 20s,
again-
like Jewish militias would have been effective in like Germany?
Well,
He
I think
didn't
it's
say
probably
that-
quite easy to
if
say
one
no.
say
He
that-
didn't say it would have been
Wait,
effective.
doing
He said
it
it couldn't
what?
have hurt.
If one time traveler could make the difference, then presumably a time traveling militia of Jews would also be able to make one.
I'm just a painter. Why are all these people trying to
Look,
kill me?
Hey, a new Netflix series coming out, right? The time traveling Jews. They're going back and solving all the world's problems. No, I think that again, the problem with violence is once you open that box, it's like starting a wildfire. You can't necessarily control what happens after you kind of unleash this thing.
Wait, you
The
can't
response
anyways.
could give
You already can't control what happens.
You can.
Yeah.
There are more. You have more options when you are less violent.
Who is you?
What?
Yeah.
Wick, if your movement, if people in your movement are engaging in
you can point
Wick,
to
no, Wick. No, this is important. You seem to have this conception of political movements as if they're like a faction, like a unit in a strategy game, where you can just pick the non-violent option. If members of that group engage in violence, and that is then used to characterize the whole group, thereby making, for example, maybe violence the only viable option available to them, and so on and so forth. That's not true in all cases. In fact, in the vast majority of cases, you don't have the capacity to redirect a movement once it's already committed itself to a certain type of action.
If you can't control
or once a certain
what,
type of action.
okay, if you are in a situation where you cannot control what anyone else is doing, you have lost. But you always
you
have
can't-
the ability to at least somewhat control what
no
your
individual.
movement does.
Wick, in any given movement, the vast majority of people, maybe all of them, can't control the direction of the movement. Whose position are you assuming when you say
What do you
control the
mean?
direction of the movement?
Look at the civil rights movement. Do you not think that MLK had very strict and tight controls over his protest?
He didn't have control. He had influence. And no, he didn't have
Oh my-
unanimous control over every black
It
civil
was
rights actor
pretty-
or every
he was
black
pretty
rights actor,
disciplined.
and so on and so forth.
They were
No,
pretty-
the reason that the civil rights movement was so effectively nonviolent across the board was because multiple organizations were not like even I think it was like the overwhelming majority
Yes.
of Black Americans
You had-
were pro nonviolence. Like Malcolm X was just like I mean he was a represented a very small minority at the time. Yeah.
Yes, so you have that fortuitous situation. And Wick, I agree.
It wasn't
The
fortuitous. What do you think?
It was
this
incredibly
happened by accident?
fortuitous.
Wait, no, stop. You
It
are
would take
you are
so
making this
little.
argument that this was
No,
an
it would take
accidental
so- it
thing,
would take-
that it just
would take
happened.
so little,
No,
Wick.
this took
Wait,
work.
Wick.
It took effort. It took
Wick.
time. It took influence.
Wick, what Loner Box Wick,
and
Wick,
eat it out.
find your chi. Wick, what Loner Box is indicating is that there was this immense scaffolding that allowed, for example, protest doctrine to be enforced, to be disseminated.
How do you think that scaffolding came about? Do you think it appears
Because it happened to be the case that in this particular time, in this particular place, particular people formed organizations and community roots that allowed them to influence the movement of large numbers of people. That is not always the case. Sometimes, for example, protest is the result of top-down action and is spontaneous from multiple sectors at once, in which case none of these sectors has unanimous control over all of the others, and sometimes if some of them are engaging in violence, the only way to counter that violence, if you prioritize that, is to cut the legs out from the whole of the movement itself.
But again,
I think if you're talking about an act of violence, I think it should be quite easy. Like we can only act with the information we have right now. I think if you can just justify any particular act at a time, just do that, right? For example, looking back at Stonewall, I think that was perfectly justified because they were literally fucking raided in their space by the police for no fucking reason, right? The burning of the police precinct. I don't know if that should be after George Floyd died, right? I don't think that should maybe be adopted as a strategy, but they were perfectly justified in doing that. The state literally failed the people they were supposed to protect by letting one of their agents murder a guy. So,
Well,
but
I mean, that's what
taken
we're
incident-
advocating for.
But is anyone advocating the how would I put this? Fuck. I feel like I can't even ask this question because
I
it's
can
like
get behind that.
Fed posting. But if we're talking about, does anyone think that America in 2023 is in a stage where violence would be a reasonable strategy?
Wait, violence blanketly? What the fuck does that mean?
Well, okay, so
You just
Well, no,
mentioned
let's
people-
go.
Yes,
Let's
no,
go.
no, no, no.
Like,
Yes.
Let me ask
Yes,
Joe.
I
wanna
agree.
ask
No,
Joe.
yes.
I wanna
I
ask
will
Joe
say
something.
yes.
Can I ask
Wait,
Joe
yeah, but I'm answering.
Okay, you can
Yes,
answer.
I agree. My preferred policy position is kill. Just
Listen, you
kill.
can-
Hey, memes aside, I'm curious what Doe thinks. Doe.
I need
do
to
you
clarify what I
think-
mean by violence, right?
No, I understand. Well, I want Doe to answer the question. Doe, do you
A
think
deer. Continue.
do you think that in 2023 in America, violence, in whatever form you want to define it as, is the answer here? Do you advocate or would you advocate for violent agitation, disruption, protest, whatever you want to call it? Can you elaborate? I want to give you space to elaborate because I don't want this to be Fed posting, right? But can you explain?
I think that so I care about what's just, and I think that solidarity is the method of justice and freedom, and that I think that is a far better tactic than blanketly nonviolence. I think that like knowing that the person next to you will help de-arrest you if you're at a protest and a cop starts engaging in violence against you, or knowing that like these kinds of things. I think that I do think that violence is acceptable in certain cases in certain times in 2023 America. Like, yeah, but
De-arrest is in like fight off the cop who's arresting someone.
de-arrest? Yeah. Have you ever seen a de-arresting?
Yeah,
At a
like I don't know if
protest?
I haven't seen one, but it's okay. So like,
never-
a cop's
you never
arresting
seen-
someone. No, I haven't seen it, but a cop's like Just Up Oil, like they're getting arrested and other people should like muscle the cops off of the protester.
Have you? This is a very common protest tactic. It's called de-arresting. You should look into it.
Well,
you
hang
don't
on.
even
Okay,
need.
I mean, if you want other
You don't
people to
even
do
need
that,
to muscle
grab
them
'em.
off. Like, what if you just like block their access to their vehicle? Like we
That
said,
too.
blocking traffic is
You're committing
non-violent.
violence
So-
against the monopoly on legitimate
Yeah.
physical violence here.
Usually
so-
people like push them over, push the cops over, stuff like that. That's usually the method in protests to stop them from like zip tying someone or whatever. They like, they help break the zip ties and push the cop over.
Yeah,
I'm
and then
just
they
gonna say,
assimilate them
right?
back
Yeah,
into
we're
the
just,
tribe.
just going to say, first of all, do so at your own risk then, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. We're not demanding sacrifice, but any good movement for social change will accept some sacrifice because that's how it goes.
I wonder, and I don't know, and this is a legitimate question. I wonder if it would be more efficacious to allow the arrest, right? Because again, we have
For
other
Efficacious for who?
for the people who want to do the change.
The police
if you
are
want your
the
actual-
police famously arrest people as a secret insidious protest move in favor of the protesters because they know that arresting the
happens
protesters is
sometimes.
only to the advantage of
show-
the protesters.
Yeah, if you could
not
demonstrate
only-
an unjust arrest, if you could demonstrate that somehow, which I don't even think you necessarily need to interfere with the police to do so. And this is part of the martyr. This is an extension of the martyrdom idea strategy, right? If you can demonstrate an unjust arrest, that's going to be extremely effective for your movement. Whereas if theoretically,
You mean if you can,
what
you
if
mean if you
it's
can
worth it?
win?
as
What if
opposed
it's
to
not
interfering
unjust?
with the police in an unjust way, in a way that is not interfering with an arrest that is otherwise not considered unjust, all that's going to do is arm critics of your movement.
No,
How
not
would you-
necessarily. So
Well, yeah,
Lunar
necessarily.
brought
Physical
back
solidarity is not
You
an
have
idea.
literally no evidence on this. Stop saying necessarily.
So, okay, can I
course
say,
people
because
are-
Lunarbox brought up an example of this earlier with the contrast between the protests before Bull Connor and then the Bull Connor protests. Like, I don't remember the exact names, but as he was saying, like before that, the police were really prepared and they arrested protesters and they actually made provisions to send them off to off-site jails. And the protesters got basically nowhere. And it wasn't until they came up against Bull Connor, who was like psycho, right? And started arresting people willy-nilly and like giving the orders to, or not giving the orders, but like the police got itchy trigger fingers, so to speak, right? And that ended up contributing to the martyrdom that we're talking about, right? So
Yes, the more violent the cops are, the more it's good for your
yeah,
movement.
but no, but that's the thing though, is right. Not all arrests are quote unquote unjust, right? Quote unquote unjust from the perspective of the legal
Can you
system.
so
So
look,
if we're
I-
if you,
look,
you
I
maybe
wanna-
you need to
can you define
de-arrest. What?
So I'm asking. So when you say it's not unjust, are you talking about someone who's gone and blown up a police building?
No, we're
How about
talking.
this, Wick?
Then what are you?
How about
talking
this?
about?
How about this?
I'm talking
How
about.
about
normal-
someone who cements themselves in front of steamrollers and whatnot on legally sold land that is the traditional territory of some group, okay? That is not an unjust arrest in the eyes of the law. They are actually obstructing someone's rightful disposition of their own property. However, nonetheless, like they are protesting the unjust appropriation, misappropriation of an entire community's traditional territory.
Sure. If
etc.
you want to do that, but you have to. So in that
But
case, I
you-
think de-arresting hurts your cause rather than helps it. I
How?
think that allowing yourself to be
Because
arrested
how?
has a much bigger way.
No, because
For me, I'll let
you can't.
explain.
No, because the criteria for being able to use an unjust arrest as a protest move is predicated on being able to establish it as unjust before a general public. But the general public is presumably going to be the general public of some legal system, right?
No, because what you're doing when you allow yourself to be arrested is you're highlighting and calling attention to an unjust law. Look,
That
I'm
doesn't
doing
follow.
this, and I can
every
be
single
arrested for this,
Wait.
and police can do
That's
violent.
not
No,
true.
that just demonstrates the
legally.
existence of a law, Wick. That's all.
Yeah,
if you want to
protest could-
change the law,
The goal of a protest could be to draw attention
Wait,
to a law, right?
Maybe
for
the
example.
protest that's being engaged in isn't one against the law that you're being arrested under. For
Yes.
example, police officers oftentimes say this has been deemed a you're not allowed to gather here anymore. This is an illegal gathering now, even though it is a legitimized protest. They got permission from the city or whatever. They will declare it now illegal and start arresting people who are there. Like, you're not trying to change that law by protesting whatever it is you're protesting, whether
Yeah,
racial injustice or whatever.
So your thesis, Wick, is that they should allow themselves to get arrested because then it will highlight the law against squatting on someone else's property. That's not what they're.
or
that's
the
not
law
what they're
in the
protesting.
case of Doe,
But they're not
right?
protesting squatting.
Well, I'll give you
on
a real world example of this, right? So there have been people who've
BlackRock.
been arrested. I'll give you a
I
real
thought
world
we
example. There's people who've been arrested for
Why is it whenever we bring up an
illegal.
example, you just like say, "Oh, we have to talk about the generalities. We have to talk about the generalities." But now
Because
you're
we can
like getting
go
to
back
bring up
and
your
forth
own
on specific
examples.
examples all night long, and we can say, well, in this example, in this
But then
example,
what were you
but we
just
have
doing?
data,
Wick? That's what you
but
were
we
doing. You were
have
bringing up a
data.
specific example.
because the general data just disproves you. And
Now
so
we're
it would
talking
be
about
a
the
very
general
short
data. We've
conversation.
moved from every single time we talk about the general data, problems with the general data. Well, hang on, I've got a specific example. Well, hang on, Wick, but the general. No, but you can go back to the general data all you want. Okay, fine. Well, there's a specific example. We have a counter-specific example. Well, the specific example doesn't establish anything. We have the general data.
I think there's a difference between using an example to point to as a representative example versus using an example as either a typification of how things can. Well, yeah, basically that versus using an example of a typification or an example of how things can work. Or
Yeah,
a
but that
typification.
that's what I
relies
was
on you
trying to
having demonstrated that it's a representative example. And
No, that's what I'm saying is that the examples that Wick has protested again have been in the context of using them as arguing them as representative or applicable to a more
yeah,
representative.
but you have to
whole.
lay the groundwork for them being representative. You can't just say this is representative and then
Well,
just.
he's saying that ours were unrepresentative, and that's what Wick was
Yes.
pointing out. But I don't think that that's true, because the entire thing that we've been saying is not that these are purely representative of every single social movement, but that these are events which occur and which you cannot just dogmatically
Well,
refuse
I
on
just-
the basis of nonviolence,
I
because
see to that.
many of the biggest ones are they still have to do with violence.
I've
That's
already
still
seeded the ground that there are specific incidences, right? There are specific scenarios, there are specific contexts where violence is not only justified but moral as well, right?
We
It's
win,
not only
boom.
moral but
Good job, gang.
But that's not the argument, as I said in my opening statement. My opening statement was
You may
clear.
say so.
It's
but
not
the debate
that
is non-violence versus
non-violence
violence.
or that violence never can work. My argument is that in general, non-violent civil resistance is more efficacious post-World
But
War
you
II.
haven't established this. In fact, every single state that exists, every law-giving entity was established by violence. This is why sociology generally refers to states, refers to law-giving entities, refers to authorities and sovereigns as those who hold a monopoly on violence. Why? Because it is violence which establishes the case.
But by that definition of violence,
Well, so
voting
mu-
is violence, and no one understands voting to be violence. So come on.
Well, also, the appeal to history and the creation of states is a little weird because a lot of states were authoritarian, regimes were overthrown, wars were had. Like, none of us are as saying that in the case. Like, I
don't
think
They were
know
it's
if
overthrown,
fascinating.
really?
I think
Were they
that-
peacefully overthrown? Were these
No,
regimes
no,
overthrown by
that's-
non-violence?
That's
What are you
my
referring
point.
to?
Well, in some cases, yes, but no, that's generally not.
No,
That's my point.
in no
That's my-
cases.
Well,
Never in the
that's
history of
literally-
mankind has a state been overthrown non-violently.
That's
Yeah, I don't think-
But that's not even my point. All of us agree
But
here.
you said
And
it.
what about? I'm sorry. This is about what you.
No, but
this
that's a
is-
concession. That's a
Oh my
concession
God,
that
can you let
damns
me-
you.
can you let me
Because what
finish?
you just
No,
no,
it's
but
not.
Mr.
No, hold
Professor
on.
Mead,
What I'm saying-
hold
what I'm
on.
saying-
Professor
Me
Mead,
first,
go
then
ahead.
me.
Professor Mead, go ahead.
traitor.
What I'm saying is that no one here is saying either that there is no situation in which a war is justified or that the overturning of an authoritarian state or something like that is never justified. And none of us are saying that if you decide in any case in history to do those things, that violence is not a reasonable way to do it. Of course, if you're going to literally overthrow a regime and institute a revolution, violence is justified. That's not the conversation.
So what you're saying, to be clear, is that violence is only justified in cases. Violence is only unjustified in cases where you're trying to make particular policy changes, but not for some reason in cases where you want to overthrow the entire normative structure.
Well, I think.
Well, no, I'm
Obviously,
saying,
you're gonna overthrow a
I'm saying
structure, you need to use
specifically that violence is justified if you're trying to
but here's
overthrow an
the
entire
problem
structure.
though. No, but here's the
I
problem.
disagree with you on this, by the way.
If you concede that in history we have myriad cases of entire legal systems being overthrown and restructured and reorganized, et cetera, by violence. Well, that's basically it. That makes it an intrinsically efficacious force.
Well, yeah, but if we're talking about a protest, the point of a protest isn't to do a insurrection. That's an insurrection, not a
Well,
protest.
that's not entirely true.
Wait,
So,
wait.
for example, well,
That's
hang on.
not necessarily
Wait.
true.
The Iranian Revolution was cited as an example of peaceful protest earlier.
It was.
That was precisely that, though.
Okay, so you're telling me a minute ago
So it was
you
a
said that peaceful
revolution
protest-
that was
Hold on, so you're telling
non-violent
me-
that we can
so you're
point
telling
to
me-
that
so you're
overthrew a
telling me-
regime.
Yeah,
So
you're
your
telling me a
entire-
minute
Why
ago
would
you
the
said
president-
that
Wait.
No.
Okay, Wick.
Yeah. So again, you cited that there's been no regime change that has happened that has been non-violent. But again, we can point to 1979 revolution in Iran. That was entirely non-violent.
But
So
it
you were
wasn't
just
entirely
wrong,
nonviolent.
sir.
It wasn't
You were just
entirely
wrong.
nonviolent.
Entirely
Wick,
nonviolent.
how
It
did
was
the
mostly
Shah?
nonviolent.
But hang on.
Yeah.
How did the Shah get ousted? Was he elected out of office? You don't know, of course. No, he wasn't. It was not a non-violent thing at all.
Was he violently ousted?
It was marked by frequent attacks by the secret police against, for example, funeral arrangements and so on and so forth.
Again,
was not
but that didn't
non-violent.
help the state. It hurt the state. That
We're
violent.
not talking about whether or not the state was violent. We're talking about,
Yes,
I think it's pretty
protesting.
standard history that the Iranian Revolution, like on the revolutionary side, they were mostly, not completely, but mostly nonviolent,
Yeah,
right?
Okay, but that not completely part is
99%.
important because the non-violent part didn't take over the state.
Is that
It-
true?
it absolutely
I did.
Because
I read up on this the last time that
Khamenei
it was
got like
discussed.
90-something% of the vote. Right?
So basically what happened is that because the Ayatollah stressed martyrdom as an Islamic principle, the protests were generally oriented around nonviolence. However, they were marked with frequent rioting, and the closer they got to actually taking over the government, the more violence became like an act of the state. So for example, the Ayatollah worked initially alongside communist and secular groups like the Revolution or the National Front, National Front, I think. But then the closer they got towards actually achieving the full insurrection, the more sort of institutional violence got cemented. And then, of course, when the Ayatollah took reign, there were mass killings of the people who previously worked with him.
Yes, and guerrilla warfare was frequent. Sorry, go on, Doug.
Oh, I think I was actually.
Oh, was
So,
that
were you going to say something? I think I was
No,
going to say
you're good.
something. Yeah. So, what I was going to say is that, like, I think the Iranian Revolution is also interesting insofar as it necessitated, at least at the end, violence against part of the protest movement. Right? Like they required it. Like, how do you think they suppressed the communists and their former allies after they overthrew the government? Like, they
I
had.
think it would have been better if they hadn't.
I agree that it. I agree that it
So
would.
well, I just what
But-
do you
but
what do you
think-
necessary?
But you're talking about success, are you not?
Mhm.
You're talking about success. Do you not agree that part of the
I'm
quote
just gonna
unquote
be real. A
success?
fascist theocracy, right, is not my definition of a total success. It's partial success, right?
No,
But-
no. In the literature, when you say success, we mean achievement of
They
movement
their
goals.
goals,
We don't
Do you
mean
think they
we
would have
like the
not
goals.
achieved? Do you think they still could have achieved their goals without killing the communists? I think they could.
I don't think that they would have been nearly as successful because then they would have had another political bloc that they would have had to contend with.
I feel like I added too much in that last, so I'm going to balance it out and provide an example of what could be argued to be an insurrection that was properly nonviolent. The People Power Revolution in the Philippines, which was an effort to oust a corrupt leader and succeeded, an end to a 20-year dictatorship. A famously peaceful series of protests. You can look it up. Enormous participation. Obviously, there were riots in the course of these protests. It's fairly inevitable, but the character of them was overwhelmingly peaceful.
Yes,
I think
and we can look
Armenia
at the-
2018 is another good example as well. That was like that was a very peaceful revolution. Yeah.
in the Serbian in the 1998 again. I'm going to refer to that. We can go example over example of this, right? So your characterization of every single state has come to power through violence is just not true.
And it doesn't even matter because if, like, assuming that it is justified,
Well, hang on.
no one here disagrees that assuming that it's justified to have a revolution, that you can't use violence. No one here thinks that.
The state is that entity which obtains a monopoly on the legitimate force of violence. it becomes a state by assuming that role.
Yeah, but your original point
That doesn't
was
contradict the fact
history.
that the events before they change power is like mostly non-violent, right?
That's
Yeah, your point was that
Like if I
it's
say
throughout
that the
history-
Armenian Revolution, was mostly non-violent, and you say, but they adopted the state, which is a
but
means
if
of violence. That's really
but
contradictory.
if the critical moment involves acts of violence that give it the control of the state, and that's what cements the success of the movement, then the success.
Well, yeah,
of the
like as soon
movement
as the Ayatollah took control in Iran, they killed a
similarly,
lot of
but we don't
people,
even
yeah.
need something that strong. So, for example, in order to like dogmatically hold to the idea that non-violence was sufficient, you need to be able to go back and say, well, at any given point, if the circumstances which permitted the success of this movement involved violence by any other actor that was more or less on side, you basically have to assert that it would be impermissible, strategically or morally, to manufacture that if that wasn't present. If for whatever reason that event did not fortuitously take place. That's a very strong claim you have to make.
So again, you keep acting like we have to prove that in every single situation, nonviolence is the answer, and that's absolutely not what we have to do.
Well,
All
it's
we
not-
have to
well,
demonstrate,
hang on,
all
hang
we
on.
have to show is that in most cases,
But you haven't shown that in
There's
most
more
cases.
cases.
You have a
Well, I'm
handful at
attempting to.
best if I grant every one of the cases you provided.
again, after post World War II, let's be here. And again, I can cite the works of Erica Chenoweth, who has done
After
longitudinal
post-World War
study
II.
over 1,000 cases of not longitudinal. My mistake. I misspoke. She's done with a large sample size of events from 1900 to 2006, and we can again, as she identifies it, the nonviolent civil resistance movement was more efficacious, especially after World War II.
Could I ask a question? Sorry, if we're talking post World War II, because obviously the world's very different. Is there? I'm genuinely asking. I don't know. Is there an example in the United States post World War II of a movement achieving its goals through violence, predominantly?
I think that depends on who you ask. There were elements of the anti-war protests with Vietnam that were decried as violent by hawks and conservatives, but I don't think the movement as a whole would be considered violent.
Wait, why are people saying Stonewall? Was that like?
Did they? I
Was
think
that
there's
the?
some
I
property
feel like
damage.
Stonewall was a pretty big exception in the movement, to be honest.
Yeah.
Are we presupposing success? Because most movements do fail.
True.
Yeah, but that's why I'm asking if like there was any predominantly violent movement in the U.S. that achieved
I'm-
like a particular legislation or
I want
like a political
Sirius to weigh in on this because I'm pretty sure he quoted Chenoweth directly counter to this.
Yeah, I'm actually looking for that quote as we speak. So
Find it, please.
Regardless, I don't know how important it is that anything be done purely with violence or as like predominantly
we've been
with.
willing. Yeah.
Like,
Or even
not
it's like it was
see
like a
from
part of the
both their
strategy, right?
contextual-
this
their
is
yeah, go on.
okay. I have the quote, right. So this is from a 2023 paper by Chenoweth. So this year.
Can you DM it to me too, so I can? read
Yeah,
the
sure.
context?
We have like even in the abstract, we have suggests that organized armed violence appears to reduce the chances of otherwise nonviolent movements to succeed, whereas unarmed collective violence has more ambiguous effects. So even Chenoweth doesn't have like this absolutist stance that you attribute to her. I sent it in the group chat.
So
And like
again,
she reviews multiple
she's not
studies.
saying, and again, she is not saying that in every case violence doesn't work, and in every case nonviolence does work. She absolutely doesn't say that.
But
Also, I am-
what
saying
she's
that
saying is that
majority-
there is an advantage sometimes, at least some
do
studies.
you have a word
suggest-
count, like a page where this quote is?
it's not page
I've been-
labeled,
I-
but it's
I
in
have
the
two
abstract.
things.
You can look in the abstract.
I have two things to say very quickly. First of all, I do need to dip in the next 10 minutes. Watch. Thank you.
Yeah, we
very
could
much
probably
once
end
again
this.
for covering. But secondly, I am woefully ignorant of the Filipino People's Revolution, People Power Revolution rather. But I'm reading the history of it briefly, and it seems like there were some key assassinations and acts of violence that were critical to the success of that movement as well. I don't think we can really litigate that, but I think it's once again, it is too simplistic to say in any particular case that non-violence dogmatically, or violence dogmatically for that matter, resulted in the efficacy of any particular movement. Every single one is going to be leaping off the shoulders of some act of violence or some event from before. And in the absence of that, you cannot say, for instance, in the absence of any act of violence that allowed, like nationalistic violence, on the case of Indians long in advance of Gandhi coming out of the scene as a relevant actor, that's going to pave the way for that later movement to be successful. The adjacent attacks on the British by the Indian National Army, that's going to be a critical part of the efficacy of the anti-violent movement. And the critical problem here is that in order to say otherwise, you have to conjecture an alternate universe in which this didn't occur, in which these movements were successful in isolation from these things which were an intrinsic part of the ambience. And one of the weaknesses of a debate format like this is that none of us are going to have an encyclopedic knowledge of any of these cases. But every single one of these cases are going to be hyper-particularized by their environment, which will include the non-violent action and the violent action that each conditioned the responses by outsiders that made the movements either efficacious or made them sympathetic, et cetera, or made them alarming enough to even be paid attention to, et cetera, et cetera.
So I will read this quote from the abstract, the role of violence and nonviolence resistance, and this was published in 2023. The balance of empirical evidence suggests that organized armed violence appears to reduce the chances for otherwise nonviolent movements to succeed, whereas unarmed collective violence
Organized
has more
armed violence is very
ambiguous
specific,
effects.
though. Organized
that's
armed
what-
violence is very
You gotta let me finish this, right? I'm giving you the whole quote.
But it's
whereas
fractal in the
unarmed
effect.
collective violence has more ambiguous effects. This is no way suggests that it is beneficial. It's simply more ambiguous than the violent, organized, armed, violent resistance. So
Yeah, but
no, it does
hold on.
not.
If you
This is
go
very
read
much
the article,
dishonestly, I
Wick,
think, framed
Wick,
by you, Sirius.
I'm not
If
trying
you
to
had read this,
dishonestly frame.
Mysterious Man,
Okay.
I understand you may not be trying to, but it is. It is given this impression that is not substantive, at least by this quote. And
What do you think?
Explain what
I
that
haven't
quote
read this
means.
paper.
Explain what the quote means.
Sure. It means that whereas we could see a clear distinction where obviously armed, violent, organized militias, groups like that are detrimental to the success of a nonviolent movement. When it comes to non-armed, otherwise violent movements, the data is more mixed.
Okay.
And so, in what respect is it mixed, though? Because if you read the full article, she talks about the different studies that have looked at
I haven't read the article to
Okay.
let you know,
So, but-
so I can't speak
and
on that. But when
that's
you
fine.
say that when I asked for the quote and you gave it to me from the abstract, that's all I can go off of because I don't have
Okay,
time
that's
to sit
fine.
here and read it.
So
We can't
maybe
get
you don't trust my retelling of the paper, but what I'm
No.
saying is that okay, well, never mind then. You can.
No,
Well, I
Come
don't
on,
trust it.
serious,
That's
but-
not a dig on you. That's not a dig on you.
Yeah.
I just don't trust anyone to tell me what a paper says. I want to read it myself,
I
right?
think it means he's skeptical as a baseline.
All right. Well, I mean, this is my reading of the paper is that if you look at the studies she reviews for that claim, there's a couple things. So first of all, sometimes studies have like actually contradictory conclusions. But in other cases, what she reviews is that different studies have different focuses and focus on and have different ideas of what success or failure means, right? So in such a case, you need to weigh the long-term outcomes for yourself. It can't just be, it's not just that they disagree on effective versus not effective in the same respect. They're talking about different respects in which something might be effective. That's why it's ambiguous, is because sometimes for some movement goals, it is effective, and then for others, it's not. So that's what I mean by what I'm doing, which is taking an anti-absolutist approach, where I don't think that we should take violence off the table, even in mostly non-violent movements, because a violent flank can have effects that are beneficial to the overall movement, even if the rest of it is non-violent.
I understand that we can never know the future, but we can know the odds. And again, if you had to bet your life and you had to bet your movement's success on things, we can play the odds here.
But we can't, though. The odds are conditioned by the data, which is conditioned by how we've categorized and identified all these different elements.
Well, that's what I want to know about is when you talk about the violent flank, is this like, are we treating like the violent flank as if it's part of a strategy? Because again, if we're talking United States in recent history, whether it was both civil rights or BLM, in both cases, you guys were saying earlier that most Americans didn't like MLK or.
I like this point.
I haven't even started the point.
Okay,
but also that picture of MLK like in front of the burning building, be like, I'm going to have a peaceful protest that was put out by that right-wing propagandist. Like, that opinion on civil rights and MLK fell as groups started to adopt violence more frequently, right? Black Panthers emerged in '66. I think a couple of the old civil rights movements had started to adopt like the kind of the self-defense doctrine. And at that time, as violence was escalating, even after MLK riots, the approval of those movements started to fall. And with BLM, when the riots started, approval fell. So I feel like in the United States that
but for example, if you didn't have radical regime change during that period,
that violent wing doesn't seem to help. It actually does seem to hinder.
No, fair enough. By the same token, it wasn't efficacious in the opposite direction either. If you didn't have radical regime change, there's no reason to think that the civil rights movement wouldn't have been unefficacious for an additional few decades, maybe not more.
If you didn't have radical, can you say that again? Sorry.
Given the conditions under which the Civil Rights Act was actually put into law, there's no reason to think in the absence of that it would not have been an extensively long time. Perhaps Lyndon B. Johnson doesn't win after Kennedy, and the Civil Rights Act is never put into effect.
No, that's I think at that stage, I think even like that, so that is true that. That nonviolent strategy can only last so long, right? If MLK and the civil rights movement had been ignored for another 20, 30 years, then more people are going to become pro-violence. But I think
how do you know what well, I think one of the problems here though is that in order to say that nonviolence as a strategy is viable, we're sort of assuming that we have somebody who has a book of references to past protests and is making a calculation and therefore is dictating the activities of a movement, and
but
then his dictations. No, they don't.
You're saying this in a hyperbolic sense, but I promise you, organizers of movements absolutely look towards.
No, we know this isn't the case, right? Because if we look at how many people talk about like local level politics in America and how these crazy fucking hockey moms have like all the power, and like they're not like, there's no organization of hockey moms saying don't be violent. They just do, they go into fucking town halls and they lobby congresmen and they get quite a lot of shit done in their favor at their local level,
It's organized. And in fact, one of the reasons
right.
The point though, Wick, is that the movement as a whole, which is characterized by the media as the movement as a whole. By the way, I need to run like in 2 minutes. But the movement as
I think we should do our closing statements then, and you should take your 2 minutes to do so now.
Damn. Oh, okay. Well, fuck. I hadn't really thought of my closing statement. I guess what we haven't really seen here tonight is any strong argument against the efficacy of violent action in cases where, for example, there isn't a demonstrated advantage in terms of positive media portrayal, general popular sympathy towards the group that is protesting, etc., etc. We seem to default to sort of a dogmatic assertion that nonviolence has some intrinsic optical advantage, even though an optical advantage relies upon all the mechanisms that produce the optic in the first place. If you're under a situation in which your movement is held in contempt, its constituent members are held in contempt, or the media is corrupt such that it will not accurately portray your actions, your nonviolent actions have zero positive effect as representations of your movement, and therefore there is absolutely no reason to attribute any kind of political advantage to that type of action in the first place. It's not to say that we should valorize a violent action as in some way just more based, quote unquote, than non-violent action, but to take it off the table and to treat any dip into violent action as in some sense intrinsically anti-pragmatic or inefficacious is simply to condition people to cut the legs out from under their own movement if they step out of the bounds of civility politics as defined by a police state which upholds itself by violence. It is once again to prefer the violence of the state arbitrarily, implicitly, for literally no reason other than it has successfully attained a maximal level of violent efficacy, which for some reason you are not willing to allow for any other movement but the state.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Wick.
Your hair is looking lovely today, by the way, Vosh.
Thank you for endearing yourself to the moderator. Wick, go ahead.
Okay, well, I don't know how to respond after that compliment, right? I will say this. It is not enough to say that nonviolence doesn't always work. Obviously, it doesn't always work. What I think I have demonstrated today, through both anecdote, intuition, and through data, is that on the whole, post-World War II, nonviolence gets things done more effectively than violence. We have to look at what happens after the protest, what happens after the change. And again, no change is perfect. No movement is perfect. There's always going to be bad actors. There's always going to be violent actors in a movement, but it's how that movement responds to it that is important. Nonviolence is both morally and effectively superior in most cases. That is not to say all cases. This is not a dogmatic approach. This is me dealing with reality as it is. People prefer stability, rightly or wrongly. That's what most people want. And that's what most people look at when they see you being a destabilizing force and a violent force. Generally, that turns people off of the movement. If you aren't ingratiated yet into the public, the way to ingratiate yourself into the public, which you want to do, is not through violence. You want to ingratiate yourself. Yeah, you want to ingratiate yourself, and nonviolence is the answer, actually.
Doe, go right ahead.
Sure. I think to exist as a living thing is to be a force in the world, and to be around other living things means never discounting the possibility that confrontations will intensify. As you can see, our opponents have not shied away at all from their martyrdom beliefs. They do believe that oppressed peoples should wait, get beaten, get abused, get killed, get arrested, as long as it's good for democracy. Efficiency is the name of their game. They don't care about what is right or just. They have almost not at all tried to actually tackle the just question in this debate. They routinely have only talked about, effectiveness at achieving their goals, which to them is some policy change. There are far more goals. Direct action is, of course, the tactic by which you immediately get what you need by, directly. There is no mediation on the scale of the state or anything like that. If you don't want an oil pipeline there, you get rid of it. If you don't want someone to be arrested, you de-arrest them or whatever. This, of course, is not a blanket strategy for every context and every situation. This is just, I just believe that we have to remain allegiant to justice.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please, Lonerbox, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know. I like it when people get things done and make improvements in people's lives. And I think it seems to be the case that in recent history, since World War II, in liberal democracies, the best way to achieve that is either through lobbying legislators or voting or protesting and engaging in civil disobedience, or, prime example, the civil rights movement. And, there will always be people saying you're not violent enough, you're too much of a pussy bitch or whatever. Actually, one person who said that to MLK was Malcolm X. Malcolm X called him a house Negro. He called him an Uncle Tom. End of the day, MLK, the people he was associated with, got the legislation passed, made one of the biggest achievements in African-American history, and Malcolm X just kind of sat on the sidelines complaining that not enough crackers were getting beaten up at the protests. It's literally true. There is a time and place for violence. If you're in Ukraine and your president is literally ordering cops to fire on you, you should rise up. Yeah, of course. In the Weimar Republic, I know Vosh's stream likes to talk about that. A really good opportunity there when democracy had effectively been killed by the Papen coup in 1932. That was like a perfect opportunity for socialists and social democrats and communists, of whom there were plenty, armed, to stand up. They didn't, because the KPD were a bunch of tanky dumb fucks who actually wanted to destroy Weimar democracy along with fucking the Nazis. So there's a time and place for violence. I don't think America in 2023 is necessarily it. If you want to de-arrest a protester, just bear in mind it's like a felony charge. It can get you up to 40 years in jail. I know it's really easy to tell other people to do that, but just take care, right? Know the risks.
Weird slight. Very weird slight.
All right.
It's not weird. It's direct.
Thank you. Serious, please.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have that much more to add. I think that we should always be open to any given tactic at any given time. We shouldn't preclude ourselves from violence just because like some people find it a little bit icky. I agree with like I'm pretty sympathetic, maybe more so even than President Sunday and Doe, to like talks of efficiency and that kind of stuff. But it's not always going to be the case that nonviolence is the best strategy, and we should never like take something off the table categorically. That's all I'm advocating for, is that we should not categorically take violence off the table, and that, you know, even when there is nonviolent protest, it's not an all or nothing deal. It's not the case that an overall nonviolent movement is always it can't benefit from having violent elements in some cases. That's all.
Thank you. And finally, Professor Meat, go ahead.
There's been, as far as I can see it, there's been a lot of conflation of terms, a lot of ambiguating of terms here. I guess I'll just say, like, whether it's the word violence or the word protest, like, if we're talking about violent versus nonviolent protesting, like, protesting is ingratiation. Like, you're trying to get people on your side, you're trying to get your message out there, you're trying to get people to agree with you, you're trying to get people to want to pass a certain policy, for a certain leader to resign. It's some form of ingratiation. If you're saying that you're trying to do a revolution, well, that's not a protest. There may be protesting happening at the same time, but the revolution itself is not protest. If you're saying that there's an authoritarian regime that is literally forcefully preventing you, literally, authoritatively, forcefully preventing you from protesting, well, forcefully allowing yourself to protest is different than protesting. Like, these actually happen on the same side. I know it might seem like I'm being nitpicky, but fundamentally these are technically different things. And in the case of protesting, in the case of ingratiation, listen, I'm not fundamentally against violence as some axiom either. I actually think I'm probably more comfortable in theory morally with the idea of violence, probably with the other people on my team over here. But the thing is that we're talking about categorically versus non-categorically excluding things. The problem is that when it comes to a society that are not fitting these authoritative prerequisites, where force in the ways that me and Wick and Lonerbox would use the term, not in the most ambiguated way, when literal force and if you're existing within an actual authoritative regime, then if you're existing outside of those bounds, then you are sort of putting yourself outside the category of violence being effective in protest. Because the great thing about societies that are not authoritarian regimes, are that they're sort of based upon the more liberal ideals that all societies tend towards over time, which is cooperation.
Okay. And for my part, my opinion is that all violence is bad all the time. I'm not a threat to the United States or her interests, and my only moral position at all is that crimes are wrong. Thank
Before you go, my chat is dying to know, how's the cat?
He's doing wonderfully, perfectly healthy.
Hell yeah.
Hey, thank you for the mostly peaceful debate tonight.
I thank you all very much for
My people are moving into position as we speak.
for coming out. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Okay,
You
thanks,
too.
Josh.
Thanks, Josh. Take care.
Thanks.
You too.
Thanks, guys.
Everyone have a good one. Take care.
All right.
Cheerio.
Bye. Oh.
Now they're there.
Well, that was about as productive as I expected it to be. That was one of the harder ones to remain neutral on. Obviously, I'm far more sympathetic to Serious Sundays and Doe's perspective on this. So a recap from my perspective really quick. As discussed briefly in the debate there, violence is essentially inevitable in any protest movement large enough. Seriously, if you have millions of people who are discontented about something, the likelihood of somebody resisting arrest or doing an arson or breaking a window are essentially 100%. So there will always be violence in a large enough movement. And of course, nonviolent elements exist to even violent movements. I mean, not every person in ISIS is out there doing combat shit, right? A lot of them do recruitment shit, which is literally an optics game, hearts and minds, so on and so forth. So the real question is, like, how do you respond to this? What's effective? What isn't? What's moral? What's not? Something has to be both effective and moral for it to be justifiable, of course. I mean, you wouldn't want to do something ineffective just because it's right, because then the outcome of what you're doing doesn't get you what you want. So so you're not getting a good outcome, in which case it's not moral, really. With that in mind, there are a lot of complexities here, right? Obviously, most of the time when you have any kind of protest going on, you want to appeal to the interests of the majority of the population, or at least enough people to affect some change. The problem is, of course, we don't actually know what will or won't be popular in the future, and it's not always a good metric for determining what will or won't actually get done. Again, Martin Luther King Jr. died an unpopular man, and back when he was doing his, say, March in Washington, or the protests and the speeches and the bus boycotts and so on, overwhelmingly, in poll after poll after poll, the majority of people thought that this was bad. They thought it was harmful to the cause of the black man. They thought that it was self-destructive because, of course, the polling that was done to ask white people for their opinions on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was done so in this like paternalistic, looking down on you, white liberal attitude, right? They weren't asked, do you think the black man deserves more rights? They were asked, do you think Martin Luther King Jr.'s protests assist the black man in their cause or only harm it further? Because then it's not a matter of the white person's opinion on black liberation. It's a matter of whether or not they think MLK is doing a good job. And something like 80% of them didn't. And yet, the civil rights movement got passed, and racism is over. As we all know, that solved everything. Malcolm X definitely was not as principled or as effective of a protester as MLK, not even remotely close. However, it is worth pointing out that the FBI allowed MLK to exist. The FBI killed Fred Hampton and destroyed the Black Panther Party. Something was up there, right? Like, there's a reason why the state, and again, keep in mind, it's not like the state liked MLK, right? But there's, Hoover told him to kill himself, right? But there's a reason why MLK was allowed to do what he did, and the Black Panther Party wasn't. And there was an immediate collaboration on a city, state, and federal level to destroy the Black Panther Party. And that's because black militancy, like real militancy, was very threatening to white hegemony, even though it wasn't popular with white people. Now, keep in mind, the Black Panther Party wasn't violent in the way that you might think they were, right? They had guns and they showed up outside courthouses, but it's not like they were doing mass shootings or whatever, like their guns were a statement piece. It was a part of their outfit. It was a way of demonstrating power. But for the most part, the actual tactics they employed were community organizing and showing up at places looking scary. But that was enough to get a lot of their leaders killed or FBI'd in some fashion or another. So why? What about black militancy scared the establishment so much, even though MLK was way more effective on a national scale? Well, this is where I'd say there's more to a protest than optics. There's more to a protest than just the raw percentage value of the population that you can convince. There's way more to it. And Malcolm X understood that. And he acted as a kind of dark parallel to the, relatively, at least in the minds of people broadly, like upstanding and well-to-do and respectable and blah, blah, thing that MLK was going for. And I think that juxtaposition is worthwhile, maybe good peaceful protests need at least less perceptively peaceful, because again, the Black Panther Party wasn't like running around shooting people, but they were perceived as less peaceful. Maybe they need that threatening element. Another good example is in India, right? Gandhi was a peaceful guy, and Gandhi led peaceful movements. But do you think there wasn't fighting between the Raj and like the British occupiers and like Indian protesters? No, of course there was fighting. India is a huge country. Of course they were fighting. Gandhi was a central figure, of course, but there was an underlying context of violence, and that was real violence, not like the Black Panther Party, who looked scary. In India, they were machine gunning other people to death. It was significant. You see this parallel all over the place too, right? Like Nelson Mandela was a peaceful. Well, Nelson Mandela is really complicated. He did so much stuff; it's difficult to fully characterize him and what he's done and what he said. For the most part, a peaceful and institutionalist individual, somebody who works through procedure, who was willing to be arrested. God, how many times he got arrested? So many times. But there's always an underlying context of. Oh, hi, Bucks. Yeah, of course. I had a delightful time. Thank you very much. There was always a context of violence in terms of the removal of South African apartheid. Obviously, that's not a peaceful environment, and still isn't to this day. There's a lot of resentment lingering in South Africa. That's going to be a problem for a while. The point that I'm getting at here, I want to be clear. Overwhelmingly, I think that the effectiveness of non-peaceful protesting, of like deliberately violent protesting, is determined by two things. One, how peaceful is the country already? Are people used to peace? Are people familiar with peace? Have they come to expect peace? And second, how big of an issue are we talking here, right? This is why, again, like a peaceful movement in Syria, no, you take up a gun. Because in Syria, people don't expect peace. There's not really much of a civil society to like work around and through. If you want to do something, you pick up a gun, I assume. Syria, not a nice place. But America is a nice place, at least compared to Syria. So over here, people are used to peace. Wait, seriously? You're serious? That's the same... Oh, okay. Yeah, I know you. You've been in chat for a long time. Nice to hear your voice. I didn't know you were the same person. Syria used to be nice. Okay, well, times change because of us, Western Imperial. Well, it's a lot of stuff with Syria. Okay, listen. But we're used to peace here in America. So violence doesn't fly, I don't think. Not the way it does in other places. Unless it's for a cause serious enough. For example, right now, and I would never advocate for this, but right now, some people, certainly not me, have pointed out that it would be possible with a comparatively small amount of violence to disrupt institutions that will kill, in the long run, hundreds of millions due to climate change. Now, I would never make this argument myself, but some people have. Now, right now, as I understand it, based on the Stop Oil protests in England, people are so antagonistic towards climate protesters that if you even slightly disrupt them, if you're a climate protester and you hold up a lane of traffic for 1 minute, people will come out and beat you to death and everyone will cheer. They just don't care. And this is because people are retarded. That's right. Humans are very bad at understanding big problems that exist outside the scope of their immediate perception. That's it's just an IQ problem, folks, and it affects everyone. Now, over here in the West, we've been mostly lucky enough to exist in institutions and structures that will protect us from the worst and immediate effects of climate change, but not for long. And not even now. As storms grow worse and the tides rise and everything gets worse and food chain gets disrupted and it grows more expensive and climate refugees, people's perception of what is and is not an acceptable threshold for violence will shift, and so too will their familiarity with violence as the world grows darker. But only in a metaphorical sense. We'll actually be blanketed in 120-degree heat while we have these discussions. And then who knows? These discussions will take place in a very different context. We don't have to have them, of course. We could just legislate appropriately, but I don't think that's going to happen. Anyway, those are my thoughts when it comes to protesting and violence and blah-de-blah. I want to make it clear. You can go back and find consistency for me to the beginning of the Black Lives Matter protests. What did I say? I basically towed the MLK line. I wasn't being original. I just said, I don't think the rioting is great. I don't think it's good or helpful. However, I'm not going to sit here and pearl clutch over it. It's an inevitable consequence of this sort of thing. Let's just fix the problems that are causing the mass discontent. And I still believe that today. I do believe it's important if you're at a protest and you see people who are being unproductively violent to rein them in. There's one video I remember specifically of it was a far-right troll who was at a BLM protest, I believe. He was live streaming it to like DLive or something. And people in chat were like, dude, get all these black people to flip a truck. So he started shouting, let's flip this truck. And it's just like a big storage truck. There's nothing, it's just a truck, And rather than do that, all the people at the protest turned to him and weird champed him. And they were like, what are you doing? What? Why? What? And they ran him out. He was like, run. Because they kicked him out, basically. And I think that was good of them to do. I think that was exceptionally responsible of them. What would flipping the truck have done? Nothing. It's good to exercise discipline when possible. Of course, when a movement is as large as like the BLM protest with tens of millions of participants, you know, you're not going to get discipline all the time everywhere. But it's worth trying. It's worth trying and responding appropriately when bad things happen anyway. Because remember, if your concern is optics, which it should be to an extent, if your concern is optics, remember you're not doing your movement any favor by hyperfixating on the few bad actors. You know, that's not optically beneficial to the movement. That's optically beneficial to you, because now you look like the so sane protester. Oh, you're so reasonable, so wise. To the movement, it's bad. So, you know, let's all be responsible. No Fed posting, toothbrush lord. Right. Just be careful with those topics. Yes, my final conclusion is that good things are good and bad things are bad. No one yet has come up with a more convincing philosophy. That really is the apex of more. Seriously, go any ethicist, go up to them. You know, was some Kantian, Hegelian, whatever you want. Go argue with them. They won't have a counter argument. It just works. Anyway, I enjoyed hosting that, even if I wanted to talk so badly. Yeah. This debate helped me beat Slave Knight Gale for the first time. Thanks. Wow, congratulations. Fun fight, huh? I know about it, Nikolai Prime, but I haven't played it. It's hard for you to remain neutral. I'm not a really neutral guy. I do like listening to people talk, though. I'm not that ADHD. Would you ever consider doing a debate panel again in the future, like participating? I don't like doing the panel itself so much. I don't even like moderators. I like one-on-one debates where we just talk. This has been increasingly the case, you know, because most of the big disagreements I have with people now, the people who I really take umbrage with, you know, are lunatics. They're frothing demon people. They're not even humans, really. The modern conservative talking points, the nonsense that goes on these days, it's not, I don't need a moderator. What do you mean a moderator? A moderator to moderate what discourse? On the people who think that the transgender movement's destroying America? Come on now. You know, obviously you can intellectualize the discourse all you want, but in reality, I'm objectively correct and they're objectively evil. And I'd really just rather banter with them. Not even like destroying them or whatever, but just like, I don't like the artifice of superficial legitimacy that moderators convey when talking with a fucking demon, you know? But for stuff like that, though, that 3v3, that was fine. No demons there, right? Like you know, even if liberals are liberals, you know, that's not like demon territory at all. That's fine for a 3v3. You know, being a liberal is distasteful. It's not demonic. I'm glad. I enjoyed the discussion very much. There were points that I agreed with on both sides, by the way, to be clear. I do very much agree that overwhelmingly stressing the optics of peaceful engagement is necessary in America just because we're so accustomed to peace. So, you know, yeah. Oh, I do want to make it clear, though, that I am fully in favor of just doing the whole, like, everything is violence thing. Because, like, it's, you know, it's like, well, a lot of the stuff that happened in Germany wasn't illegal, right? You know, we can't do this, like, legalist distinction. So it's violence to hit a person. I agree. Is it violence to, like, destroy a window? Yeah, well, we can fold it in, sure. But like, if you're voting for a candidate and the candidate's main campaign pledge is that they want to wipe out an ethnic group, I'll call that violence, yeah. But then you get this thing where it's like, okay, well, what is violence really? Does violence describe an action interpersonally, like physically? Or does violence just mean you take an action and the outcome of which is destruction or damage to another? Because if that's the case, then a lot of things suddenly become violence. This is why most people use the term social violence when they say social violence. So social violence would be a Republican politician changing the laws concerning Medicare, which lead to 20,000 additional people a year dying because they don't have access to health insurance. Now, that's 20,000 people who are being socially murdered every year. Not directly murdered, obviously. Republican politician didn't kill all of them directly, but he did knowingly and willingly do something which led to 20,000 additional deaths a year. So that's usually when people say social murder, that's usually what they mean. Personally, I think that the term violence can be abstracted to a point of near uselessness. So I think it's very important to directly refer to what you're talking about, and sort of like name it, because otherwise you get into, that's why I try to stop the semantic stuff, but it's important semantic stuff.